Hello everyone. Tonight I've prepared a special compilation of trucker stories, all gathered into one soothing episode for you to enjoy. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It really helps support the channel. Now let's begin. Story 1. The highway that ends in the same town from Roadrunner. Ray, nobody believes me when I tell this story, but I swear on my mother's grave it happened exactly the way I'm about to tell you. My name's Ray. Been driving these highways for near about 30 years now, and in all that time I've seen some strange things. Fog that moves against the wind, lights in the sky that follow you for miles, towns that appear on your GPS but vanish when you try to find them again. But nothing, and I mean nothing, compares to what happened to me on Interstate 47 that autumn night back in 2018. It was late October. I remember because the leaves were turning and there was that crisp smell in the air that makes you think of pumpkins and warm cider. I was hauling a load of electronics from Memphis to Little Rock, a route I'd driven 100 times before, maybe more. The kind of run you can do with your eyes half closed, though I'd never recommend that to anybody. The sun had set about an hour earlier and the highway stretched out before me like a black ribbon under my headlights. There weren't many cars out that night, just the occasional pair of taillights in the distance or headlights passing in the opposite lane. The radio was playing some old country song, the kind that makes you feel nostalgic for times you never actually lived through. Around 9:30, I passed a green highway sign that read Millbrook 15 miles. Now, I'd passed through Millbrook countless times before. It's one of those small towns that exist primarily because the highway runs through it, with a gas station, a diner that serves breakfast all day, and maybe 24 houses scattered around. Nothing special, nothing memorable, just a place to stop if you need fuel or coffee or both. I wasn't planning to stop that night because I'd filled up about an hour back, but I made a mental note of it the way you do when you're counting down the miles to your destination. I drove on, watching the white lines blur past, listening to the hum of my engine and the whisper of wind against the cab. The mile markers ticked by, one after another, steady and reliable. After about 20 minutes, I saw another sign emerge from the darkness ahead. As I got closer, my headlights illuminated the words, and I felt a strange flutter in my chest. It read Millbrook 15 miles. I blinked hard, thinking maybe I was more tired than I'd realized, that perhaps I'd lost track of time or distance. But no, I checked my odometer, and I'd definitely driven more than 20 miles since the last sign. I told myself it was just a duplicate sign, maybe put up by mistake or left over from some road construction project. These things happen, right? The state highway department isn't perfect. So I kept driving, keeping my eyes on the road and trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that was starting to creep up my spine. The radio station began to fade in and out, crackling with static, and I reached over to adjust the dial. That's when I noticed something else strange. The landscape around me looked exactly the same as it had 20 minutes ago. The same cluster of trees on the left, the same farmhouse with a tilting weather vane on the right, the same curve in the road that my hands knew how to navigate without thinking. Another 20 minutes passed, and there it was again. Millbrook 15 miles. My heart started pounding then, really pounding, the kind of fear that makes your hands slick on the steering wheel and your mouth go dry. I checked my fuel gauge, half expecting it to be reading the same as before, but no. It had gone down appropriately for the distance I'd traveled. My odometer was still clicking forward. Everything seemed normal except for that sign. That impossible sign that kept appearing like some kind of cruel joke. I tried turning off at the next exit, thinking maybe I could break whatever strange loop I'd found myself in. But the exit ramp curved around and deposited me right back onto the same stretch of highway, heading in the same direction. I tried the CB radio, calling out to any other truckers who might be out there, but all I got was empty static and just once, what sounded like someone laughing very far away. The night pressed in around me, darker than it should have been, and I realized I hadn't seen another vehicle in over an hour. The signs kept coming, every 20 minutes or so, always reading the same thing. Millbrook, 15 miles. I started counting them, making little marks on a piece of paper I kept clipped to my dashboard. 5 signs, 6, 7. Each time I saw one, that feeling of wrongness grew stronger, like the world had become unstuck somehow. Like I'd driven off the edge of the map into some place that didn't follow normal rules. I considered stopping, just pulling over to the shoulder and waiting for dawn. But something told me that would be worse, that if I stopped moving, I might never start again. Around what my watch told me was 2 in the morning, though time had started to feel slippery and unreliable, I saw lights ahead. Not headlights, but the warm glow of street lamps and lit windows. As I got closer, I saw the green sign, but this time it read Millbrook, next exit. My relief was so intense I almost cried. I took the exit, my hands shaking on the wheel, and rolled into town expecting to see the familiar gas station and diner. But Millbrook was different. The buildings were the same. I could recognize their shapes and positions, but they looked older somehow, more worn. The gas station signs were dark, and when I pulled up to the diner, I could see through the windows that it was full of people. At 2 in the morning, in a town that usually rolled up its sidewalks at 9, I parked and sat there for a moment, trying to decide what to do. Finally, I climbed down from my cab and walked to the diner door. Inside, everyone turned to look at me at once, and I mean everyone, all at the exact same moment, like they'd been waiting. Their faces were strange in the fluorescent light, familiar but not quite right, like photographs that had been left in the sun too long. An old waitress with silver hair approached me smiling and said, "Welcome back, Ray, same as always." I'd never seen her before in my life, but she knew my name. She knew my name, and she was acting like I came in there every night. I stammered something about just wanting coffee, and she poured me a cup from a pot that steamed even though I never saw her take it off any burner. The coffee was good, better than it had any right to be. And as I drank it, I felt the fear start to ebb away, replaced by a strange calm. The other people in the diner had gone back to their quiet conversations, and I could hear the clink of silverware on plates, the low murmur of voices, the hiss of something cooking on a griddle. "You look tired," the waitress said, topping off my cup. "Long night on the road?" I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. "It happens sometimes," she continued, wiping down the counter with a cloth that looked like it had been white once a long time ago. "The road gets confused, loops back on itself. You're not the first to end up here, and you won't be the last. But you're here now, and that's what matters." I don't remember finishing that coffee or walking back to my truck. The next thing I knew, I was waking up in my cab with morning sunlight streaming through the windshield. I was parked at a rest stop about 50 miles past Millbrook, according to the sign I could see from where I sat. My logbook showed that I'd made good time, arriving exactly when I should have based on my departure time. There was no missing time, no gap in my memory except for the diner. When I checked my cup holder, there was a coffee cup there, empty with a faded logo I didn't recognize. "Hello, everyone. Tonight I've prepared a special compilation of trucker stories, all gathered into one soothing episode for you to enjoy. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It really helps support the channel. Now let's begin. Story 1. The highway that ends in the same town from Roadrunner. Ray, nobody believes me when I tell this story, but I swear on my mother's grave it happened exactly the way I'm about to tell you. My name's Ray. Been driving these highways for near about 30 years now, and in all that time I've seen some strange things. Fog that moves against the wind, lights in the sky that follow you for miles, towns that appear on your GPS but vanish when you try to find them again. But nothing, and I mean nothing, compares to what happened to me on Interstate 47 that autumn night back in 2018. It was late October. I remember because the leaves were turning, and there was that crisp smell in the air that makes you think of pumpkins and warm cider. I was hauling a load of electronics from Memphis to Little Rock, a route I'd driven 100 times before, maybe more. The kind of run you can do with your eyes half closed, though I'd never recommend that to anybody. The sun had set about an hour earlier, and the highway stretched out before me like a black ribbon under my headlights. There weren't many cars out that night, just the occasional pair of taillights in the distance or headlights passing in the opposite lane. The radio was playing some old country song, the kind that makes you feel nostalgic for times you never actually lived through. Around 9:30, I passed a green highway sign that read Millbrook 15 miles. Now, I'd passed through Millbrook countless times before. It's one of those small towns that exist primarily because the highway runs through it, with a gas station, a diner that serves breakfast all day, and maybe 24 houses scattered around. Nothing special, nothing memorable, just a place to stop if you need fuel or coffee or both. I wasn't planning to stop that night because I'd filled up about an hour back. But I made a mental note of it the way you do when you're counting down the miles to your destination. I drove on, watching the white lines blur past, listening to the hum of my engine and the whisper of wind against the cab. The mile markers ticked by one after another, steady and reliable. After about 20 minutes, I saw another sign emerge from the darkness ahead. As I got closer, my headlights illuminated the words and I felt a strange flutter in my chest. It read, Millbrook, 15 miles. I blinked hard, thinking maybe I was more tired than I'd realized, that perhaps I'd lost track of time or distance. But no, I checked my odometer and I'd definitely driven more than 20 miles since the last sign. I told myself it was just a duplicate sign, maybe put up by mistake or left over from some road construction project. These things happen, right? The state highway department isn't perfect, so I kept driving, keeping my eyes on the road and trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that was starting to creep up my spine. The radio station began to fade in and out, crackling with static, and I reached over to adjust the dial. That's when I noticed something else strange. The landscape around me looked exactly the same as it had 20 minutes ago. The same cluster of trees on the left, the same farmhouse with a tilting weather vane on the right, the same curve in the road that my hands knew how to navigate without thinking. Another 20 minutes passed, and there it was again. Millbrook, 15 miles. My heart started pounding then, really pounding, the kind of fear that makes your hands slick on the steering wheel and your mouth go dry. I checked my fuel gauge, half expecting it to be reading the same as before, but no. It had gone down appropriately for the distance I'd traveled. My odometer was still clicking forward. Everything seemed normal except for that sign, that impossible sign that kept appearing like some kind of cruel joke. I tried turning off at the next exit, thinking maybe I could break whatever strange loop I'd found myself in, but the exit ramp curved around and deposited me right back onto the same stretch of highway, heading in the same direction. I tried the CB radio, calling out to any other truckers who might be out there, but all I got was empty static and once, just once, what sounded like someone laughing very far away. The night pressed in around me, darker than it should have been, and I realized I hadn't seen another vehicle in over an hour. The signs kept coming, every 20 minutes or so, always reading the same thing, Millbrook, 15 miles. I started counting them, making little marks on a piece of paper I kept clipped to my dashboard. 5 signs, 6, 7. Each time I saw one, that feeling of wrongness grew stronger, like the world had become unstuck somehow, like I'd driven off the edge of the map into some place that didn't follow normal rules. I considered stopping, just pulling over to the shoulder and waiting for dawn, but something told me that would be worse, that if I stopped moving, I might never start again. Around what my watch told me was 2 a.m. Though time had started to feel slippery and unreliable, I saw lights ahead. Not headlights, but the warm glow of street lamps and lit windows. As I got closer, I saw the green sign, but this time it read, Millbrook, next exit. My relief was so intense I almost cried. I took the exit, my hands shaking on the wheel, and rolled into town expecting to see the familiar gas station and diner. But Millbrook was different. The buildings were the same, I could recognize their shapes and positions, but they looked older somehow, more worn. The gas station signs were dark, and when I pulled up to the diner, I could see through the windows that it was full of people. At 2 a.m. in a town that usually rolled up its sidewalks at 9, I parked and sat there for a moment, trying to decide what to do. Finally, I climbed down from my cab and walked to the diner door. Inside, everyone turned to look at me at once, and I mean everyone, all at the exact same moment, like they'd been waiting. Their faces were strange in the fluorescent light, familiar but not quite right, like photographs that had been left in the sun too long. An old waitress with silver hair approached me smiling and said, "Welcome back, Ray, same as always." I'd never seen her before in my life, but she knew my name. She knew my name, and she was acting like I came in there every night. I stammered something about just wanting coffee, and she poured me a cup from a pot that steamed even though I never saw her take it off any burner. The coffee was good, better than it had any right to be, and as I drank it I felt the fear start to ebb away, replaced by a strange calm. The other people in the diner had gone back to their quiet conversations, and I could hear the clink of silverware on plates, the low murmur of voices, the hiss of something cooking on a griddle. "You look tired," the waitress said, topping off my cup. "Long night on the road?" I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. "It happens sometimes," she continued, wiping down the counter with a cloth that looked like it had been white once a long time ago. "The road gets confused, loops back on itself. You're not the first to end up here, and you won't be the last, but you're here now, and that's what matters." I don't remember finishing that coffee or walking back to my truck. The next thing I knew, I was waking up in my cab with morning sunlight streaming through the windshield. I was parked at a rest stop about 50 miles past Millbrook, according to the sign I could see from where I sat. My logbook showed that I'd made good time, arriving exactly when I should have based on my departure time. There was no missing time, no gap in my memory except for the diner. When I checked my cup holder, there was a coffee cup there, empty with a faded logo I didn't recognize. Around 1 in the morning, traffic started to thin out. The spaces between vehicles grew longer, and I found myself with clear road ahead and behind for stretches at a time. The highway cut through some rolling hills in that part of Kentucky, with the median sometimes dropping down into a little gully between the northbound and southbound lanes. Trees grew thick in some spots, and the whole effect was like driving through a tunnel of darkness with just your headlights and the occasional reflector post to guide you. I was coming up on one of these deeper sections of median, where the grass sloped down pretty steeply on both sides, when my headlights caught something moving. At first I thought it was a deer, which would have been bad enough at the speed I was going. But as I got closer, I realized it was the wrong shape, the wrong way of moving. It was crawling up out of the median on the right side, pulling itself up onto the shoulder with a motion that looked wrong, too fluid and too jerky at the same time. My brain was still trying to process what I was seeing when the thing made it fully onto the shoulder, and I got a clear look at it in my lights. It was a woman, or at least it had the shape of a woman wearing what looked like a white dress that was stained with mud and grass. Her hair hung down in front of her face in long, dark tangles, and she was moving on her hands and knees, but not like someone who had fallen or was injured. She was crawling with purpose, with strength, her movements deliberate and somehow hungry. I should have just kept driving, should have passed her by and called it into the highway patrol, let them deal with whatever situation was happening there. But something made me slow down, some instinct that this wasn't a normal emergency, that something was deeply wrong. As I decelerated, I grabbed my CB radio and tried to raise anyone else on the highway, any other trucker who might be in the area. The radio crackled with static, but no voices came through, even though I'd been hearing chatter just 15 minutes earlier. The woman had made it to the edge of the pavement now, and she stopped crawling. She lifted her head, and even though her hair was covering her face, I had the unmistakable sensation that she was looking directly at me, directly at my truck. Then, with a movement so fast I almost didn't see it, she stood up, not the way a person normally stands, pushing up with their legs and straightening gradually, but all at once, like someone had pulled her up on strings. 1 second she was on all fours. The next she was standing fully upright, perfectly still, facing my truck as it rolled slowly past. I hit the accelerator, suddenly desperate to get away from her, but my truck was heavy and slow to build speed. In my side mirror, I could see her standing there on the shoulder, motionless, and then she started walking. Not toward the median or away from the road, but along the shoulder, following my truck. Her walk was like her crawl had been, too smooth and too jerky, like she was moving in a series of rapid snapshots rather than continuous motion, and she was fast, impossibly fast, keeping pace with my truck even as I pushed it harder. My heart was hammering in my chest now, real fear flooding through me, the kind of primal terror that bypasses your rational mind and goes straight to your gut. I pushed my truck as fast as it would go, watching the speedometer climb to 70, 75, 80, well past what was safe for a loaded rig on this road. But in my mirror, she was still there, still walking along the shoulder with that horrible jerking smoothness, never falling behind, never seeming to exert any effort at all. Then she moved closer to the road, her feet touching the white line, and I saw her raise one arm and point at me. Just pointing, holding her arm out straight with one finger extended, and even though I couldn't see her face through all that hair, I knew she was still looking at me, still focused on me with an intensity that felt like pressure against my skull. The temperature in my cab started to drop despite the heat outside, and I could see my breath misting in front of me. The radio erupted with static so loud I had to turn it off, and all my dashboard lights began to flicker. I don't know how long that chase went on. It felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes. I just kept the accelerator pressed to the floor, watching my mirrors, watching her keep pace with me like gravity and physics and normal human limitations didn't apply to her. Then, as suddenly as she had appeared, she stopped. Just stopped walking and stood still on the shoulder, her arm still raised and pointing. I kept driving, not daring to slow down, and watched her figure recede in my mirror until she was just a small white shape in the darkness. And then nothing at all. When I was sure she was gone, really gone, I eased off the accelerator and let my truck slow to a reasonable speed. My whole body was shaking, and I realized I was covered in cold sweat despite the humid night. I tried the CB radio again, and this time it worked, crackling to life with the familiar sound of other drivers chatting. I wanted to tell someone what I'd seen, wanted to hear another human voice acknowledge that something impossible had just happened. But when I opened my mouth to speak, no words came out. What would I even say? That I'd seen a woman crawl out of the median and chase my truck at 80 miles an hour. They'd think I'd been driving too long, that I was hallucinating from exhaustion or maybe drugs. So I said nothing. Just drove on through the night until I reached a truck stop about 50 miles down the road. I pulled in and parked, and I sat in my cab for a long time, just breathing, just trying to convince myself that I was safe. Eventually, I climbed down and went into the building, needing to be around other people, needing the fluorescent lights and the smell of coffee and the sound of normal conversation. There was a state trooper in there buying himself a sandwich, and I almost approached him, almost told him what I'd seen. But what could he do? Drive back and look for a woman who could keep pace with the speeding truck, who appeared and disappeared like smoke? I bought my own coffee and sat at the counter, listening to the other drivers talk about traffic and weather and delivery times, all the ordinary concerns of people who hadn't just seen something that defied explanation. After about an hour, I felt steady enough to go back to my truck. I walked out into the parking lot, scanning the darkness at the edges of the light, half expecting to see a white dress and tangled hair watching me from the shadows. But there was nothing there, just rows of trucks and the distant sound of highway traffic. I climbed back into my cab and locked the doors, something I rarely bothered to do. Before I started my engine, I checked my logbook to see how much drive time I had left, and I noticed something that made my blood run cold. According to the timestamps, the stretch of road where I'd encountered the woman, the stretch that had felt like it took forever to get through, had only lasted 3 minutes. 3 minutes from when I first saw her crawling to when she finally stopped following me. 3 minutes that had contained more terror than the rest of my life combined. I made my delivery the next day without incident and headed back west on my return trip. When I reached that section of highway, it was daytime and everything looked normal. The median was just grass and trees, the shoulder just asphalt with the usual litter of truck tire treads and roadkill. In the daylight, it was impossible to imagine anything strange ever happening there. But I drove past as fast as I legally could, and I haven't taken a load on that route at night since. Other drivers have told me stories over the years, late at night when we're all trying to stay awake and the conversation turns strange. Stories about hitchhikers who disappear, about figures standing in the road that vanish when you get close, about things that chase trucks and cars for miles before giving up. I listen to these stories now with a different ear, no longer quick to dismiss them as tall tales or the products of tired minds. Because I know what I saw, I know what chased me down that highway, and I know that there are things out there in the dark places between cities that we don't understand, that maybe we're not meant to understand. Sometimes when I'm driving late at night on some lonely stretch of highway, I'll see something in my peripheral vision, something white moving at the edge of my headlight beam. My heart will start racing and my hands will tighten on the wheel, and I'll hold my breath until I can see clearly that it's just a plastic bag blowing in the wind, or a pale piece of litter or a trick of shadows and light. But there's always that moment of fear, that moment where I think she's back, that she's found me again, and this time she won't stop following. That's the worst part, I think. Worse than the memory of her crawling out of the median or chasing my truck at impossible speed. It's the knowledge that she's still out there somewhere, standing on some dark shoulder or walking through some midnight median, waiting for the next set of headlights, the next driver who makes the mistake of slowing down. Story 4. The police car that turned into smoke from diesel. Dan, all my years on the road, I've had my share of run-ins with the law. Nothing serious, mind you, mostly speeding tickets and warnings about logbook violations. The kind of stuff that comes with the territory when you're trying to make a living hauling freight across state lines. I've always been respectful with cops, yes sir and no sir, knowing that they're just doing their jobs and that giving them attitude only makes things worse for everyone. But there was this one time, this one very specific encounter, that changed the way I think about those flashing lights in my rearview mirror. It happened on a stretch of highway in Nevada, one of those long, empty roads that cut through the desert where you can drive for an hour without seeing another soul. I was hauling electronics from California to Salt Lake City, making good time through the night because traffic was light and the weather was clear. The moon was nearly full, bright enough that you could see the landscape around you, all sagebrush and sand and distant mountains that looked like shadows against the sky. My radio was picking up some talk show from Las Vegas. People calling in to discuss conspiracy theories and unexplained phenomena, which seemed appropriate for driving through the Nevada desert at 3 in the morning. I'd been on this particular stretch of road for maybe 40 minutes, watching the mile markers tick by and the occasional jackrabbit dart across the pavement in my headlights. When I saw the red and blue lights flash on behind me, my heart sank the way it always does when you see those lights. That automatic guilt response even when you know you haven't done anything wrong. I checked my speedometer and I was maybe 5 miles over the limit. Nothing that would normally warrant a pullover. But I signaled and started moving toward the shoulder anyway. The police car followed me off the highway, keeping a standard distance back, and I brought my truck to a complete stop on the wide shoulder. I grabbed my license and registration, rolled down my window and waited with my hands visible on the steering wheel, doing everything by the book. Through my side mirror, I could see the patrol car sitting there behind me, lights still flashing, but nobody got out. I waited 30 seconds, then a minute, then 2 minutes, and still the door didn't open. Still no officer approached my truck. This wasn't normal. Usually they come up pretty quick, flashlight in hand, asking for your documents and explaining why they pulled you over. But this cop was just sitting there, and the longer I waited, the stranger it felt. The radio in my cab started crackling with static, even though it had been coming in clear just a moment before, and that talk show about unexplained phenomena dissolved into white noise. I reached over to change the station, and when I looked back at my mirror, the patrol car's lights seemed brighter, more intense, pulsing in a rhythm that was almost hypnotic. I decided to wait it out, figuring maybe the officer was running my plates or dealing with something on their radio. But 5 minutes turned into 10 and still nothing. The only movement I could see was the flash of those lights, red and blue, reflecting off my mirrors and the pavement and casting weird shadows across the desert. The temperature outside was probably in the 60s. Comfortable for a desert night, but inside my cab it was starting to feel cold. That same unnatural cold I'd felt once before in a situation I didn't like to think about. Finally, after what my watch told me was 15 minutes but felt like an hour, I saw the driver's door of the patrol car open. I straightened up, getting ready to hand over my documents and hopefully get this over with quickly so I could get back on the road. But instead of an officer stepping out, what emerged was different, wrong in a way that my brain struggled to process. It was shaped like a person, had the outline of a person, but it seemed to be made of the same flashing lights that had been on the car, like someone had taken red and blue illumination and formed it into a human figure. The figure started walking toward my truck, and with each step it took, it seemed to flicker and pulse, never quite solid, never quite stable. I could see through it to the desert beyond, could see the stars shining through where its chest should be. My hands were frozen on the steering wheel, every muscle in my body locked up with fear. This wasn't a cop, wasn't anything that should exist, and every instinct I had was screaming at me to drive away, to put my truck in gear and floor it and not look back. But I couldn't move, couldn't seem to make my body respond to what my mind was telling it to do. The figure reached my truck and stopped right outside my window, standing there in that flickering, pulsing state. Up close I could see that it had features or something like features, a suggestion of a face that kept shifting and changing, never staying the same for more than a second. Where its eyes should be, there were just points of brighter light like headlights or stars, and they seemed to be looking at me with an intensity that felt physical. Then it spoke, and the sound came not from outside my window but from inside my cab, from the very air around me. The voice was strange, layered, like multiple people speaking in unison but slightly out of sync, creating an echoing effect that made my teeth ache. License and registration, it said, the words distorted and drawn out, and I found myself reaching for the documents with hands that shook so badly I almost dropped them. I held them up to the window, and the figure reached through the glass, not opening it or breaking it but passing through it like it wasn't there, like my truck was made of air. Its hand, if you could call it that, was the same flickering light as the rest of it, and when it touched the papers they began to glow with the same red and blue illumination. It held them for a moment, those bright points where its eyes should be scanning back and forth, and then it spoke again in that terrible layered voice. "You've been driving too long," it said, and there was something almost concerned in its tone. If concern could be felt by something made of light and impossibility, the road is dangerous when you're tired. The road plays tricks. The road takes things. The documents drifted out of its hand and fell onto my lap, no longer glowing, looking exactly as they had before. "Be careful," the figure said, and then it turned and walked back toward the patrol car. I watched in my mirror, unable to look away despite my fear, as it reached the vehicle and seemed to dissolve back into it, the flickering figure merging with the flashing lights until I couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. And then, in a way I still can't adequately describe, the entire patrol car began to change. It started losing solidity, the hard edges of metal and glass becoming soft and undefined, and then it began to break apart into wisps of red and blue light. These wisps drifted upward and outward, dissipating into the desert air like smoke from a fire, thinning and spreading until there was nothing left but empty pavement and darkness. I sat there for a long time after it disappeared, maybe 20 minutes, maybe more, just trying to process what I'd witnessed, trying to convince myself that I'd really seen it. Eventually another vehicle came along, a regular car with a regular driver, and passed me without incident. That normal sight, that confirmation that the world was still working the way it was supposed to, finally broke the paralysis that had gripped me. I started my truck, checked my mirrors to make sure nothing was behind me, and pulled back onto the highway. The rest of that drive passed in a blur. I kept my speed exactly at the limit, kept both hands on the wheel, kept my eyes moving between the road ahead and the mirrors, watching for any sign of those red and blue lights. But I saw nothing unusual, just empty desert highway and the occasional car or truck. When dawn finally broke and light spilled across the landscape, I felt a relief so profound it almost brought tears to my eyes. I made my delivery in Salt Lake City and called home from the truck stop, needing to hear my wife's voice, needing something familiar and real and comforting. She could tell something was wrong, asked me if I was okay, and I told her I was just tired, that it had been a long drive. What else could I say? That I'd been pulled over by something that looked like a cop but was made of light? That I'd watched a patrol car dissolve into smoke? She would have told me to come home, to quit driving, to see a doctor, and maybe she would have been right. But I didn't quit. Couldn't quit. Because this is what I do. This is who I am. I'm a trucker, and the road is my life. Even knowing now that there are things out there on those long dark highways that don't follow the rules we expect. I've been pulled over by real cops plenty of times since that night, and each time my heart races a little faster than it used to. Each time I wait a little more nervously for the officer to approach my window, wondering if this time they'll be solid and real, or if they'll flicker and pulse and speak with that layered voice. Other drivers have told me stories over the years about strange encounters with law enforcement, patrol cars that appear and disappear without explanation, officers who give warnings about things that haven't happened yet, tickets that vanish from glove compartments without a trace. I used to dismiss these stories as the result of tired minds and overactive imaginations, but now I listen more carefully, pay more attention to the details, because I know what's possible now. I know what might be waiting on that dark stretch of highway when those red and blue lights flash on behind you. The thing that bothers me most, when I let myself think about it too much, is what that figure said to me. The road takes things. What did it mean by that? What has the road taken, and from whom? Are there drivers out there who didn't make it past their encounter? Who saw those lights in their mirror and pulled over and never pulled away again? And what exactly was that figure? Was it something that was once human? A cop who died on duty and somehow got bound to that stretch of highway, doomed to pull over drivers for eternity? Or was it something else entirely? Something that was never human at all, something that just wears the shape of authority to make us stop, to make us vulnerable. I don't have answers to these questions, and honestly, I'm not sure I want them. Some knowledge is dangerous, some truths are better left undiscovered. All I know is that when I drive through Nevada now, when I have to cross that long empty stretch where the desert spreads out forever under the stars, I make sure I'm well rested. I make sure my logbook is perfect and my truck is in compliance and I'm driving exactly the speed limit. Not because I'm afraid of getting a ticket, but because I'm afraid of seeing those lights again, afraid of watching them pulse and brighten in my mirror, afraid of seeing that figure made of red and blue illumination walking toward my window. The road is long and full of mysteries, full of things we don't understand and places where the normal rules don't seem to apply. Most of the time we drive through these places without knowing they're there, without seeing what lurks at the edges of our headlight beams. But sometimes if conditions are right or wrong, if fate or chance or something else decides to reveal itself, we get a glimpse behind the curtain. We see something that changes us, that makes us question what we know about the world. And we're left with a choice: to stop driving, to give up the road and find some safer way to live, or to keep going, to accept that mystery and danger are part of the bargain, that the unknown is always riding shotgun on these long, lonely highways. I chose to keep driving, but I drive different now, more carefully, more aware, and every time I see a patrol car, every time those lights flash on behind someone on the highway, I say a little prayer that whoever they've stopped sees a solid vehicle and a flesh and blood officer, not something made of light and impossibility that will turn to smoke and drift away into the dark. Story 5. The face pressed against my windshield at 70 mph from Rusty Joe. I've been called Rusty Joe for so long I sometimes forget my real name is Joseph Miller. Got the nickname back when I was just starting out. mostly because of my red hair and the rust-colored Peterbilt I drove for my first 10 years on the road. These days my hair's more gray than red and I'm driving a newer Kenworth, but the name stuck, and I've made peace with it. What I haven't made peace with, what I don't think I'll ever make peace with, is what happened to me on Highway 12 in Montana 3 springs ago. It was early April, that tricky time of year when winter's mostly done, but still likes to remind you it's not completely gone. I was hauling a load of building materials from Billings heading west, and the weather had been cooperating nicely all day. Clear skies, dry roads, just a bit of wind that buffeted my trailer now and then, but nothing serious. The sun had set about an hour earlier, and I was making good time through the mountains. Those big dark shapes rising up on either side of the highway like sleeping giants. The road was fairly empty that night, which wasn't unusual for that stretch. You'd see another vehicle every 10 or 15 minutes, mostly other trucks, occasionally a car or two. I had my CB on, but nobody was talking much. Just the usual occasional check-in or warning about a speed trap up ahead. My radio was playing some oldie station out of Missoula, Creedence Clearwater Revival, telling me about a bad moon rising, and I was thinking about stopping for coffee in another hour or so when I saw the rest area sign. Now, I didn't particularly need to stop. My tank was 3/4 full and I'd relieved myself at my last break. But something made me signal and pull off anyway. Maybe it was intuition, maybe it was luck, maybe it was something looking out for me, but whatever it was, I'm grateful for it now. The rest area was small, just a couple of parking spots and a pit toilet. One of those bare bones places that exists mainly to keep tired drivers from falling asleep at the wheel. There was one other vehicle there, an RV with out-of-state plates but no lights on inside. I pulled into a spot, set my brakes, and decided to get out and stretch my legs for a few minutes. The night air was cold and crisp, carrying that pine scent that's everywhere in Montana. Above me, the stars were incredible, the way they only are when you're far from city lights, scattered across the sky in such profusion that you could spend hours just looking at them. I walked around my truck, checking my tires and straps more out of habit than necessity, and then stood for a moment just breathing and looking at those stars, thinking about how small we all are, how vast the universe is, all those philosophical thoughts that come to you late at night in empty places. I was about to climb back into my cab when I heard something, a sound that didn't fit the quiet of the rest area. It was a tapping, rhythmic and insistent, coming from somewhere nearby. At first I thought maybe it was coming from the RV, someone inside knocking on a window or a loose piece of trim rattling in the wind. But when I listened more carefully, trying to locate the source, I realized it was coming from the direction of the highway, from the darkness beyond the rest area's small pool of light. Something told me not to investigate, some instinct that we've mostly bred out of ourselves with civilization and electric lights, but that still exists deep in our animal brains, that instinct that our ancestors relied on, that tells you when something's watching you, when something's wrong, when you should run. But curiosity and stupidity are close cousins, and I found myself walking toward the sound, toward the edge of the light, peering into the darkness to see what was making that noise. I couldn't see anything at first, just the dark shapes of trees and the ribbon of highway beyond. The tapping had stopped, and I was beginning to feel foolish for getting spooked by what was probably just a branch blowing against something. I was turning to go back to my truck when I saw movement on the highway, something pale catching the moonlight. I squinted, trying to make out what it was, and then my blood went cold. There was a figure standing in the middle of my lane, the westbound lane, just standing there perfectly still. From the distance I was at, maybe 100 yards, I couldn't make out any details, just that it was person-shaped and wearing something light-colored. My first thought was that someone was in trouble, that maybe there'd been an accident and someone was in shock, standing in the road in a daze. I started to shout, to warn them to get off the highway before a truck or car came around the bend and hit them. But before I could make a sound, I heard an engine approaching from the east, heard the distinctive sound of a big rig downshifting as it came through the curves. I could see the glow of headlights reflecting off the trees, getting brighter as the truck approached. And I knew the driver wouldn't be able to see that figure until it was too late, until they were right on top of it. I shouted then, screamed really, waving my arms even though I knew the figure couldn't possibly hear me over the engine noise in the distance. The truck came around the bend, its headlights sweeping across the highway, and they illuminated the figure fully for just a moment. In that brief flash of light, I saw that it was a woman in a white dress, her hair long and dark, her arms at her sides. She wasn't moving, wasn't trying to get out of the way, just standing there as tons of metal and cargo bore down on her at 70 miles an hour. I closed my eyes, not wanting to see the impact, not wanting to witness what was about to happen. But there was no crash, no squeal of brakes, no terrible sound of a body being struck. I opened my eyes and the truck was past, its taillights visible as it continued down the highway, and the figure was gone. Just gone, like she'd never been there at all. I stood there trying to process what I'd seen, trying to figure out how she could have gotten out of the way so fast, wondering if maybe I'd imagined the whole thing, if the darkness and the isolation and the late hour had played tricks on my eyes. I hurried back to my truck, suddenly eager to be inside with the doors locked and the engine running. I climbed into my cab and sat there for a moment, catching my breath, telling myself I'd seen a reflection or a shadow or something perfectly explainable. The radio was still playing oldies now, some song about peace and love that seemed absurdly cheerful, given what I'd just witnessed. I was reaching to put the truck in gear, ready to get back on the highway and put some distance between myself and this place, when something made me look up at my windshield. There was a face pressed against the glass, looking in at me from outside. A woman's face, pale and wet like she'd been underwater, with dark eyes that were too large and a mouth that was open too wide. She was right there, inches from me with only the windshield between us, and we were looking directly at each other. My mind couldn't process how she'd gotten up there. I was in a truck cab. The windshield was 8 feet off the ground. There was no ladder, no way for her to have climbed up. But there she was, pressed against the glass, her breath fogging it, her hands coming up to press against it too. Fingers splayed, I screamed, I'm not ashamed to admit it. Screamed like I've never screamed in my life. My hand slammed the horn and the loud blare of it filled the night, but the face didn't move, didn't react, just kept staring at me with those two large eyes. Her mouth opened wider and I could see that her teeth were wrong. Too many of them, too sharp, arranged in rows like a shark. She started to push against the glass and I could see it beginning to flex inward, could hear it creaking under the pressure. I don't remember making the decision to move. My body just acted on its own. I released the brake, threw the truck into gear, and hit the accelerator all in one motion. The truck lurched forward and I felt a thump, felt something fall or jump or get thrown from the hood. I didn't look back, didn't check my mirrors, just drove straight for the exit back onto the highway, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might burst. I merged onto the highway doing 40, way too fast for the merge, but I didn't care. I just needed to be moving. Needed to be away from that rest area and that face and whatever impossible thing had pressed itself against my windshield. Once I was on the highway proper, I pushed the truck as fast as it would go, watching the speedometer climb past 70, past 75. Other vehicles flashed past in the opposite direction, and I found myself checking each one to see if there was a figure in white standing in the road. But I saw nothing unusual, just normal traffic on a normal night. After about 20 miles, when my heart rate had slowed enough that I could think clearly again, I pulled over at another rest area, this one larger and better lit, with several other trucks parked. I needed to check my windshield, needed to see if there was any evidence of what had happened, any proof that I hadn't imagined the whole thing. I climbed down from my cab on shaking legs and walked around to the front of my truck, half expecting to see cracks in the glass or handprints or something. The windshield was completely normal, not a mark on it, clean except for the usual road grime and bug splatter. But when I looked at my hood, I saw something that made my stomach drop. There were wet marks there like someone had been lying on it, and they were shaped like a body, arms and legs splayed out. The wetness wasn't water though, or at least not just water. It had a strange oily quality to it. and it gave off a smell I'd never encountered before. Something like rotting flowers and deep mud and old metal all mixed together. I grabbed some paper towels from my cab and wiped the marks away, not wanting them on my truck, not wanting any reminder of what had happened. The paper towels came away stained with that same oily substance, and I threw them in the trash, then used hand sanitizer on my hands, trying to get rid of any residue. Other drivers were in the rest area, going about their normal business, and their presence was comforting, a reminder that the world was still normal, still following its usual rules. I called my dispatcher from the payphone, told him I needed to take a break, that I was ahead of schedule, and wanted to rest for a few hours before completing the delivery. He grumbled but approved it, and I went back to my truck and climbed into the sleeper berth, locking both doors first. I didn't sleep, couldn't sleep, just lay there in the dark, listening to the sound of other trucks coming and going, listening to voices on the CB radio, reassuring ordinary sounds that told me I was safe. I don't know if Pete was right. Don't know if there's any truth to his theory about thin places and walls between worlds. All I know is what I saw, what pressed its face against my windshield while I was doing 70 miles an hour down a Montana highway. I know that it was real as the truck I drive and the road beneath my tires. And I know that it's still out there somewhere, standing on some dark highway or pressed against some other driver's windshield, looking in with those too large eyes and that too wide mouth. So when I drive at night now, I'm more careful about where I stop. I avoid small isolated rest areas, prefer the big truck stops with lots of lights and lots of people. I check my mirrors more often, scan the road ahead more carefully, looking for figures that shouldn't be there, for pale shapes standing where no one should stand. And sometimes when I'm stopped at a light or waiting to merge, I look up at my windshield and make sure nothing's looking back. Story 6. The truck that started itself. Every midnight from Iron Ike. They call me Iron Ike because I've got a reputation for being tough, for handling the long hauls and difficult loads that other drivers don't want. Been at this for 35 years, started when I was just 19 with barely enough money for my CDL license, and worked my way up from driving beat-up day cabs to owning my own rig. A beautiful 2015 Freightliner Cascadia, black with chrome trim, kept it in perfect condition, maintained every system, replaced parts before they failed. That truck was my pride and joy. My home away from home, my livelihood and my freedom all rolled into one. Was, I say, because I don't own it anymore. Sold it last year for less than it was worth just to be rid of it, and I'll never forget why. It started about 3 years ago, not long after I'd picked up the truck from a dealer in Tennessee. The previous owner had died, which should have been a red flag, but the price was right and the truck was in excellent mechanical condition, so I didn't think much of it. The dealer told me the old owner had been a driver named Marcus something, didn't catch the last name. Said he'd died suddenly of a heart attack while parked at a rest stop in Georgia. His family had sold the truck back to the dealer rather than try to find a buyer themselves. Wanted to be done with it quickly, wanted to move on. I drove that truck for months without any problems. Logged thousands of miles, made good money. Everything was running smoothly. It handled like a dream. The engine was strong, fuel economy was better than I expected. I was congratulating myself on making such a good purchase, thinking about how this truck was going to carry me through to retirement in another 10 or 15 years. Then came the first night I noticed something strange. I was parked at a truck stop outside of Little Rock. Had shut down for the night around 10 p.m. after a long day's drive. I'd done my usual routine, checked all my systems, set my alarm for 6 a.m., climbed into the sleeper berth and settled in with a book. Around 11:30, I turned off my reading light and lay down to sleep, listening to the familiar sounds of a truck stop at night, the idle of engines, the occasional air brake hiss, the distant murmur of voices from drivers heading to or from the building. I'd just started to drift off when I heard my engine turn over. Not start fully, just that initial turnover sound like someone had turned the key, followed by the engine catching and beginning to idle. My eyes snapped open and I lay there in the dark, confused, wondering if I'd somehow left the engine running earlier, though I knew I hadn't. I climbed out of the sleeper berth and looked at the ignition, and the key was in the off position right where I'd left it. But the engine was definitely running. I could feel the vibration through the floor, hear the steady rumble of it. I turned the key to the on position and then back to off, and the engine died immediately. Must be an electrical problem, I thought. Some short in the wiring that was causing it to start on its own. Annoying, but fixable. I made a mental note to take it to a mechanic in the morning and climbed back into the sleeper, though sleep was harder to find now, my mind turning over possible causes and solutions. Eventually, exhaustion won out and I drifted off, not waking until my alarm went off at 6. When dawn came, gray and cold but wonderfully normal, I felt brave enough to continue. I finished my delivery without incident and headed back east on Highway 12, passing that small rest area in full daylight. It looked completely innocuous, just a pull-off with some parking spaces and a bathroom. Nothing sinister or strange about it at all. But I didn't stop, and I've never stopped there again. Always make sure to plan my trips so I'll pass it during the day if I pass it at all. I've told this story to a few other drivers over the years, usually late at night in truck stop restaurants when the conversation turns to strange experiences on the road. Most of them listen politely, but I can see the skepticism in their eyes. See them thinking I fell asleep at the wheel for a moment and had a vivid dream, or that I'd been driving too long and hallucinated the whole thing. A few have nodded slowly, though, and told me they've had similar experiences. Faces in windows where faces shouldn't be. Figures that move impossibly fast. Things that press against glass and metal and try to get inside. One old driver, a guy named Pete who'd been on the road for 40 years, told me something that stuck with me. He said that highways are thin places, that the constant motion and the isolation and the late hours create conditions where the walls between our world and somewhere else get worn down. He said that most of the time nothing comes through, but sometimes in certain spots at certain times, something slips across, something that's hungry or curious or just drawn to movement and light, and the warmth of living things in metal boxes rolling through the dark. The next day I took the truck to a mechanic I trusted. He explained what had happened. He spent 3 hours going over the electrical system, checking every wire, every connection, testing the ignition switch and the starter relay and everything else he could think of. Found nothing wrong. Everything was in perfect order. No shorts, no loose connections, no reason the truck should have started on its own. He suggested maybe I'd dreamed it, or maybe there'd been some kind of power surge in the truck stop's electrical system that had somehow affected my truck. I paid him for his time and left, wanting to believe he was right, that it had been a one-time anomaly. But it happened again the next night, and the night after that, and the night after that. Always at exactly midnight I could set my watch by it. The engine would turn over and catch and begin idling, no matter where I was parked, no matter what I did to try to prevent it. I tried removing the key completely and taking it into the sleeper with me, but the engine still started. I tried disconnecting the battery before bed, but in the morning it would be connected again, and the engine would have run at some point during the night. I could tell by the warmth of it and the fuel gauge reading slightly lower. Other drivers started to notice, started making comments on the CB about the truck that ran itself every midnight. Some thought it was funny, made jokes about it being haunted or possessed. Others were less amused, complained about the noise disturbing their sleep, asked me when I was going to get it fixed. I took it to 5 different mechanics over the next 2 months. Good mechanics with years of experience, and none of them could find anything wrong. The truck was mechanically and electrically perfect. There was no reason it should be starting on its own, but it kept happening. I started to dread nighttime, started to feel anxious as midnight approached. I tried staying awake to watch it happen, to see if I could catch something, some detail that would explain it. And I did watch on several occasions, sitting in the driver's seat with the interior lights off, waiting. At exactly midnight, the key would turn in the ignition, physically turn like invisible fingers were moving it, and the engine would start. I'd watch it happen, unable to look away, feeling the hair stand up on the back of my neck. Then things started getting worse. About 6 months after it started, I began noticing other changes. The radio would turn on by itself at midnight, always tuned to a station that played old country music, songs from the 50s and 60s. The heat or air conditioning would adjust itself, moving to a temperature I hadn't set. The windshield wipers would activate even when it wasn't raining, sweeping back and forth in a slow, steady rhythm. It was like the truck had developed a mind of its own, like it was being operated by someone else, someone I couldn't see. I started researching the previous owner, this Marcus, whose name I'd never fully caught. It took some digging, some calls to the dealer and to the DMV and to trucking companies that might have employed him. But eventually I pieced together some information. Marcus Thornton, 58 years old when he died, had been a trucker for 35 years, same as me. He'd bought the Freightliner new, had it customized exactly the way he wanted, drove it for 5 years before his death. According to people who'd known him, he'd been obsessive about his truck, treated it like a person, talked to it, named it Midnight because of its black paint job. The more I learned, the more uneasy I became. Marcus had died in the truck, yes, but the circumstances were strange. He'd been found in the driver's seat at a rest stop at 6 a.m, engine running, hands on the wheel, dead from what the coroner ruled was a massive heart attack. But witnesses said they'd heard his engine start up at midnight, had assumed he was leaving, but then it just kept idling all night. When someone finally checked on him in the morning, he'd been dead for hours, probably since shortly after midnight. I tried to tell myself it was all coincidence, that there was no connection between Marcus's death and the truck's behavior. But deep down I knew better. The truck started itself every midnight because that's when Marcus had always started his days. That's when he'd turn the key and begin driving, preferring to travel at night when the roads were empty. The country music was what he'd listened to, according to people who'd ridden with him. The temperature settings, the wiper speed, everything was adjusting itself to his preferences, not mine. The truck wasn't malfunctioning, it was remembering. Somehow, some way, Marcus's routines and habits had become embedded in it, and every night at midnight the truck was acting out those routines like a ghost going through the motions of its former life. I was driving a haunted truck, living in a space that belonged to someone else, someone who died there and maybe in some way never left. I tried to make peace with it, tried to accept that this was just how things were going to be. The truck ran perfectly during the day, never gave me any mechanical problems, was reliable and strong, and everything I needed for work. The midnight starting was just a quirk, I told myself, something I could live with. But then came the night when I woke up and realized the truck was moving. It was about 3 weeks ago. I'd parked at a rest area in Missouri and gone to sleep around 10 as usual. The midnight starting happened right on schedule. Woke me briefly, but I'd gotten used to it by then and just rolled over and went back to sleep. But sometime later, I don't know exactly when, I woke up with the feeling that something was different. The engine sound was different, higher pitched, and there was a sensation of movement. That familiar feeling of the truck rolling down the highway. I scrambled out of the sleeper berth and looked at the front of the cab, and my blood turned to ice. We were moving, doing about 60 miles an hour down the highway, but I wasn't driving. The driver's seat was empty, but the wheel was turning itself, adjusting to curves, staying centered in the lane. The pedals were depressing themselves, the brake, the accelerator, all moving like invisible feet were operating them. Through the windshield, I could see the highway stretching out ahead, lit by my headlights, and we were passing other vehicles, changing lanes when necessary, driving with more skill than I could have managed myself. I lunged for the driver's seat, grabbed the wheel, tried to take control, but it was like wrestling with something incredibly strong. The wheel fighting against my grip, trying to steer itself. I managed to get my foot on the brake and press down hard, felt the truck start to slow and the wheel jerked violently in my hands, nearly breaking my grip. We were down to 30 miles an hour when I felt something else, a presence in the cab with me, a cold spot of air and a sense of anger. of territorial rage. The radio came on at full volume, that old country music blaring so loud it hurt my ears, and all the lights in the cab began flashing on and off. The temperature plummeted, my breath coming out in clouds, and I could swear I heard a voice deep and rough shouting at me to let go, to get out, that this was his truck, his time to drive. I held on to that wheel with everything I had, kept my foot on the brake, brought us down to 15 miles an hour, 10-5, until finally we rolled to a stop on the shoulder. The moment we stopped, everything went quiet. The engine died, the radio cut off, the lights stopped flashing. The cold faded and the presence disappeared, leaving me alone in the cab, shaking and sweating despite having just been freezing. I sat there for the rest of the night with every light on, waiting for dawn, not daring to sleep, keeping one hand on the door handle in case I needed to run. In the morning, I drove straight to the nearest town and called a dealer I knew. Told him I needed to sell my truck immediately that day if possible, and I didn't care about getting full value for it. He asked questions, but I didn't answer them. Just told him the price I'd accept and said it was non-negotiable. We completed the sale that afternoon, and I took a significant loss on it, but I didn't care. I bought another truck, a different make and model with a clear history, and I've been driving that ever since. I never told the dealer why I was selling, never mentioned the midnight starts or the moving on its own or any of it. I figure Marcus and his truck are together now, working out whatever unfinished business kept him attached to it. Maybe the new owner won't experience any of it. Maybe Marcus only had a problem with me being there, or maybe they're dealing with it right now, waking up at midnight to the sound of an engine starting itself, slowly realizing that they're not alone in that cab. I hope whoever has it now, if they're experiencing what I did, that they're smarter than I was. I hope they get rid of it sooner. Don't wait until it tries to drive itself with them sleeping in back, because that's the thing about haunted objects, about places and things that hold on to the dead. They don't usually want to share, don't usually like new people coming in and taking over. They want what they had before, want everything to be the way it was, and they'll do whatever they can to make that happen. I still see that truck sometimes on the road or at truck stops, recognize it by the black paint and chrome trim, and the way it sits just a little lower on the left side. A quirk Marcus never got fixed. And every time I see it, I check the time. If it's near midnight, I make sure I'm far away, because I don't want to see it start on its own. Don't want any reminder of those months I spent driving something that belonged to someone else, someone who died behind that wheel and apparently decided he wasn't done driving yet. Story 7. The rest stop where everyone knew me. From Lonely Larry, people call me Lonely Larry. And I suppose the name fits well enough. I've been divorced twice. My kids don't talk to me much anymore, and I spend most of my life alone in my truck cab, driving from one place to another with nothing but the radio and my own thoughts for company. I'm not complaining, mind you, just stating facts. Solitude suits me in most ways. Keeps life simple, keeps expectations low. But there was this one time, this one very strange experience, where I found myself surrounded by people who acted like they knew me, like we were old friends. And it was the loneliest I've ever felt in my entire life. It happened on Interstate 40, somewhere in the long stretch between Oklahoma City and Amarillo. I'd been driving for about 8 hours, making good time with a load of furniture heading to California, and I was starting to feel the fatigue settling into my shoulders and back the way it does after too many hours behind the wheel. The sun was setting ahead of me, painting the sky in those brilliant oranges and reds that you only seem to see out in the plain states. And I was thinking about finding a place to stop for the night when I saw the sign for a rest area 2 miles ahead. I didn't remember this rest area from previous trips down this route, but then again, I didn't make a habit of memorizing every pull-off and facility along the way. Rest areas come and go, some get closed down, new ones get built, and unless there's something particularly memorable about one, they all blend together after a while. This sign looked standard enough, blue with white lettering, indicating restrooms and parking and picnic areas available. I signaled and took the exit, my truck tires humming on the off-ramp as I decelerated. The rest area was larger than I expected, with a good-sized parking lot that could accommodate maybe 20 trucks and twice as many cars. There was a modern-looking building in the center, all glass and tan brick with landscaping that seemed unusually well-maintained for a highway rest stop. Several vehicles were already parked there, a mix of trucks and cars and one RV, and I could see people moving around heading to and from the building. Nothing unusual, nothing that should have raised any alarms. Just a normal rest stop on a normal evening. I parked my truck in an empty spot, set the brake, and climbed down from the cab, feeling my knees pop as my feet hit the pavement. The air was still warm from the day, but starting to cool, and there was a breeze carrying the smell of sage and dry grass. I stretched, working the kinks out of my back, and started walking toward the building, planning to use the restroom and maybe grab a soda from a vending machine if they had one. As I approached the entrance, the door opened and a woman came out, middle-aged with short gray hair and a friendly face. She looked directly at me and her face broke into a huge smile, the kind of smile you reserve for someone you're genuinely happy to see. "Larry!" she exclaimed, her voice warm and familiar. "We were wondering when you'd show up. You're running a little later than usual tonight." I stopped walking, confused, wondering if maybe she was confusing me with someone else. "I'm sorry," I said. "I think you've got me mixed up with somebody." But she laughed and waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, stop it, Larry. You're always so modest. Come on inside, everyone's here." She held the door open for me, still smiling, and there was something in her expression that made it seem rude to argue. So I walked past her into the building. Inside was even nicer than outside, with clean tile floors and modern fixtures and an openness that most rest stops don't have. But what really struck me was the people. There were maybe a dozen of them scattered around, sitting on benches, standing by the vending machines, and every single one of them turned to look at me when I entered. And every single one of them smiled. That same warm, genuine smile the woman outside had given me, like they were old friends seeing someone they cared about. "Larry," a man called out from across the room, heavy-set with a trucker's cap and a beard. "Good to see you, buddy. Your usual spot's waiting." He gestured toward a bench near the windows, and I saw that someone had placed a styrofoam cup there, steam rising from it. I walked over slowly, my mind trying to process what was happening, and picked up the cup. It was coffee, and when I took a tentative sip, it was exactly the way I liked it. 2 sugars and a splash of cream, even though I'd never told anyone here how I took my coffee because I'd never been here before. "How did you know?" I started to ask. But the bearded man interrupted me. "Come on, Larry, we've been meeting here every Thursday for what, 3 years now? Of course we know how you take your coffee." Thursday. Today was Thursday. But I'd never been to this rest stop before, I was sure of it. And I definitely hadn't been meeting anyone here every week for 3 years. I tried to explain this, tried to tell them there was some mistake. But every time I opened my mouth to say it, someone else would start talking to me, asking me about my week, commenting on loads I'd supposedly hauled, referencing conversations we'd supposedly had. A younger woman with long brown hair approached me with a plate of cookies, homemade by the look of them. "I made your favorites, Larry. Those oatmeal raisin ones you're always going on about." I stared at the cookies, and they did look exactly like the kind my grandmother used to make, the kind I'd loved as a child but rarely ate anymore. Without thinking, I took one and bit into it, and the taste was perfect, exactly right. Exactly the way I remembered. But I'd never told anyone about my grandmother's cookies, never mentioned them to a soul. The longer I stayed in that rest stop, the stranger things became. People kept approaching me, kept talking to me like we had history, like we shared memories. They referenced things that had happened in my life, personal things that only I should know about. My first dog's name, the town where I grew up, the song that had been playing when I proposed to my first wife. They knew about my kids, asked how Sarah was doing in college, even though I hadn't talked to Sarah in 2 years and had no idea how she was doing. They knew about the fishing trip I'd taken with my father the summer before he died. Knew about the truck I'd owned 20 years ago that had broken down in the middle of nowhere. I felt like I was losing my mind. like reality had become unmoored somehow. These people knew me, really knew me, knew things that were private and personal and true, but I didn't know them, didn't recognize a single face, couldn't remember ever meeting any of them before. It was like walking into a surprise party thrown by strangers, everyone acting like you belong, but you have no idea why you're there or how they know you. "Are you feeling all right, Larry?" the woman from outside asked, putting her hand on my arm with genuine concern. "You seem a little out of it tonight." I looked at her hand on my arm, felt the warmth of it, the solid reality of the touch, and I wanted to tell her everything. Wanted to explain that I didn't understand what was happening, that I was scared and confused. But when I opened my mouth, what came out was, "I'm fine, just tired from the drive." She nodded sympathetically. "Well, you should eat something before you get back on the road. Linda brought that casserole you like so much." She pointed to a table in the corner where several dishes were laid out, covered with foil and plastic wrap, like this was some kind of potluck dinner. And there, among the dishes, was a casserole that looked exactly like one my mother used to make, with that distinctive pattern of cheese and breadcrumbs on top. I walked over to the table as if in a dream, picked up a paper plate and served myself some of the casserole. Other people gathered around, filling their own plates, chatting with me about mundane things, weather and traffic and routes they'd driven. Their voices washed over me like waves, familiar and friendly, but also wrong. So deeply wrong that I felt like screaming. Instead, I ate, and the food tasted like home, like comfort, like all the meals I'd had at family gatherings over the years. Time passed in a strange way in that rest stop. I couldn't tell you how long I was there, whether it was 30 minutes or 3 hours. The light outside the windows never seemed to change, stayed in that perpetual dusk, not quite dark but not quite light either. People came and went, but the core group remained, always finding reasons to talk to me, to include me in conversations, to treat me like I belonged. And the terrible thing, the really terrible thing, was that part of me wanted to believe them. Part of me wanted to accept that I came here every Thursday, that these were my friends, that I had this community of people who knew me and cared about me. Because the truth was, I was lonely. The name they all knew me by, Lonely Larry, it wasn't just a handle, it was the truth. I spent my days and nights alone, driving from place to place without connection, without anyone waiting for me at the end of the road. My ex-wives had moved on. My children had their own lives, and I'd become a ghost, passing through the world without leaving much of a mark. So when these people treated me like I mattered, like they'd been waiting for me, like my absence would have been noticed and regretted, it touched something deep inside me that I tried not to acknowledge. But it was also wrong, fundamentally wrong. And some part of me knew it even as another part wanted to surrender to the illusion. These weren't my memories, this wasn't my community. And no matter how much they acted like they knew me, I didn't know them. I was a stranger here, and their knowledge of me was impossible, unnatural. Like they'd reached into my mind and pulled out everything private and personal and were now playing it back to me. I stood up abruptly, the paper plate falling from my hands and landing on the floor with a soft sound. Everyone stopped talking and looked at me, their faces showing concern and confusion. "I have to go," I said, my voice coming out rougher than I intended. "I need to get back on the road." The bearded man stood up too, reaching out like he wanted to stop me. "But Larry, you just got here. Stay a little longer, we hardly got to catch up." "I can't," I said, backing toward the door. "I'm sorry, I can't stay." I turned and walked quickly toward the exit, and behind me I could hear them calling my name, asking me to wait, saying they'd see me next week, same time, same place. I pushed through the door and out into the parking lot, and the air outside felt different, cooler and cleaner. Like I'd been in a stuffy room and finally made it outside. I practically ran to my truck, climbed up into the cab, started the engine with shaking hands. As I put it in gear and started to pull out, I looked back at the building and saw them all standing at the windows, watching me leave. They weren't smiling anymore, their faces showed something else. Something like sadness or disappointment or maybe hunger. They stood there perfectly still, watching, and I couldn't shake the feeling that they were waiting, that they'd be there next Thursday and every Thursday after, waiting for me to come back. I drove back to the interstate and merged into traffic, putting distance between myself and that rest stop as fast as I legally could. I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see the building following me somehow, or those people standing on the side of the road. But there was nothing unusual, just normal highway, normal traffic, normal night falling across the plains. After about 50 miles, I pulled over at a different rest area, one that looked properly run down and impersonal, and checked my GPS and my atlas to see if I could find that first rest stop, to see if it was marked on any maps. There was nothing. No rest area listed on that stretch of Interstate 40, not in my GPS, not in my trucking atlas, not when I searched for it online on my phone. According to every resource I had, there was no rest stop where I'd stop, just empty highway running through empty land. I sat in my truck for a long time, trying to decide if I'd imagined the whole thing, if maybe I'd fallen asleep at the wheel and dreamed it. But I could still taste that casserole, could still feel the warmth of that coffee cup in my hands, could still hear them calling my name. I've driven that stretch of Interstate 40 many times since then. Always during the day now, always alert and watching for any sign of that rest area. I've never seen it again, never seen that exit or that sign or that building. But sometimes late at night when I'm on some other highway far away, I think about those people and how they knew me. I think about how they had coffee waiting, exactly how I liked it, and food that tasted like home, and how they talked to me like I mattered. And the worst part, the part that keeps me awake sometimes, is that I wonder what would have happened if I'd stayed, if I'd accepted their version of reality, if I'd agreed that yes, I did come there every Thursday, yes, we were friends, yes, this was my community. Would I have been happy there in that impossible place with those impossible people? Would it have been so bad to have connection? To have people who knew me and waited for me even if it was all wrong? Even if it was built on some kind of supernatural lie? I tell myself I made the right choice by leaving. That whatever that place was, it wasn't real, and staying there would have been dangerous. But I can't shake the memory of how it felt to walk into a room and have everyone smile at me. To have someone hand me coffee made just right. To hear my name spoken with warmth and familiarity. That's a powerful thing, especially for someone like me. Someone who's chosen solitude but sometimes wonders if it was really a choice or just what happened when you stop trying. Other drivers have told me stories about rest stops that appear and disappear, about places that exist in the gaps between the normal world and something else, places that offer what you need or what you want, but at a price you don't understand until it's too late. I think about that rest stop as one of those places. A spot that saw my loneliness and offered me a solution, offered me friendship and community and belonging. But the price would have been accepting an impossible reality, giving up my grip on what was true in exchange for what felt good. I'm still out here driving, still alone most of the time, still earning that nickname that everyone uses, but I'm more careful now about where I stop, more aware that not every rest area is just a rest area, that some places are traps disguised as havens, and I'm more aware of my own loneliness, of how it makes me vulnerable to things that promise connection, even when that promise comes from strangers who shouldn't know my name, but somehow know everything about me. If you're out there driving the same roads I do, if you're alone in your cab late at night and longing for someone to talk to, someone who understands, be careful about the places you stop. Be careful about rest areas that feel too welcoming, about people who know you too well, about coffee made exactly right by someone you've never met. Because loneliness makes us desperate, and desperate people will sometimes accept any shelter from the storm, even when that shelter exists in the space between one reality and another, even when the price of admission is forgetting that you never should have been welcome in the first place. Story 8. The frozen figure on the roadside from Redneck Rick Now. I know what you're thinking with a name like Redneck Rick, and yeah, I fit the stereotype pretty well. Born and raised in rural Alabama, Dropped out of high school to start working, got my CDL as soon as I could, and been hauling freight ever since. I like country music and sweet tea, and I say y'all without even thinking about it. But don't let the name fool you into thinking I'm stupid, because I'm not. I've seen enough strange things on the road to know that the world is bigger and weirder than most people want to admit. And what I'm about to tell you is the strangest thing I've ever seen, bar none. It was the middle of February, one of those years when winter just wouldn't let go, kept dumping snow and ice across the northern states week after week. I was hauling a load of automotive parts from Detroit down to Atlanta, and I'd planned my route to avoid the worst of the weather, swinging a little west through Indiana and Kentucky rather than taking the more direct route through the Appalachians. Even with the detour, though, I ran into some nasty conditions. Freezing rain that made the road slick and dangerous. The kind of weather that makes you grip the wheel a little tighter and pray you don't see brake lights ahead of you. I was coming through southern Indiana on Highway 64, moving slow and careful, when the freezing rain intensified to the point where visibility dropped to almost nothing. I could barely see 20 feet in front of my truck, and the road was getting icier by the minute. I knew I needed to find a place to pull over and wait it out. Wasn't worth risking my life or my load to keep pushing through conditions like that. I was watching for an exit or a wide shoulder when I saw something standing on the side of the road. At first I thought it was a trick of the ice and the headlights, just my eyes playing tricks in the poor visibility. But as I got closer, slowing down even more, I could see clearly that there was definitely something there, a figure standing perfectly still on the shoulder. As my headlights illuminated it fully, I realized it was a person, or at least it had the shape and size of a person, but something about it was wrong in a way that made my stomach clench with instinctive fear. The figure was completely covered in ice. I mean completely. Like it had been standing there so long that the freezing rain had built up layer after layer, until it was encased in a thick coating of ice. I could see the basic human shape, arms at the sides, legs together, head slightly tilted forward, but all the details were obscured by the ice. It looked like one of those sculptures you see at winter festivals, carved from a block of ice, except this wasn't carved. This had formed around something real. I slowed my truck to a crawl, trying to decide what to do. My first thought was that someone had died out there, that some poor soul had gotten stranded in the weather and frozen to death standing up, which was horrible but not impossible. I should call the police, I thought, should report this so they could send someone out to recover the body. But something stopped me from reaching for my phone, some instinct that said this wasn't what it appeared to be, that I should just keep driving and not look back. I'd almost convinced myself to do exactly that, to just keep moving and call it in once I was safely down the road when the figure moved. Not much, just the slightest turn of the head, but it was definitely movement, deliberate and aware. Ice cracked and fell away from where the head had turned, revealing glimpses of something underneath, but I couldn't make out what. My foot hovered over the accelerator, torn between fleeing and stopping to help. Because if someone was alive in there, if someone was trapped in that ice and still moving, I couldn't just drive past. I made the decision to pull over, told myself I'd stay in my truck, would just roll down the window and call out to see if they responded, if they needed help. I brought my truck to a complete stop about 20 feet past the figure and set the brake, leaving the engine running because there was no way I was turning it off in this weather. I rolled down my window and cold air rushed in, carrying with it the smell of ice and something else, something chemical and wrong that I couldn't identify. "Hey!" I shouted into the freezing rain. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" My voice sounded small and swallowed up by the weather, but I knew the figure had to have heard me. We were close enough. For a long moment there was no response, just the sound of rain hitting ice and asphalt and the idle of my engine. Then the figure moved again, this time more dramatically, turning its entire body to face my truck. More ice cracked and fell away, and what I saw underneath made me question everything I thought I knew about the world. The ice had been covering something, but it wasn't a person. Not exactly. It was person-shaped, but where the ice had fallen away, I could see that the surface underneath was wrong. metallic and smooth, like polished chrome or steel. There were no clothes, no skin, just this reflective surface that caught and distorted the light from my headlights. And where the face should be, where I expected to see features, there was just a blank expanse of that same metallic surface, featureless and somehow watching me despite having no eyes. The figure started walking toward my truck. Not fast, but with a steady, purposeful stride that sent panic flooding through my system. Each step it took caused more ice to crack and fall away, revealing more of that impossible metallic body. Its movements were too smooth, too perfect, like a machine designed to mimic human motion but not quite getting it right. I slammed my window shut and threw my truck into gear, not caring about the icy road or the poor visibility, just needing to get away from whatever that thing was. My truck fishtailed slightly as I accelerated, the trailer swinging out before the traction control caught and straightened us out. I checked my mirror and saw the figure still walking, still coming toward where my truck had been, moving with that same steady mechanical pace. But now that I was farther away, I could see more of it, could see that it wasn't alone. There were more figures like it, maybe 5 or 6 of them, all standing at intervals along the roadside, all covered in ice, all perfectly still until something came near them. I drove faster than was safe for the conditions, my heart pounding, hands shaking on the wheel. Behind me in the mirrors, I watched those figures recede into the distance, watched them return to their standing positions on the shoulder, returning to stillness like statues waiting for the next traveler to pass. The freezing rain continued to fall, and I knew that ice was accumulating on them again, covering up that metallic surface, making them look once more like unfortunate people who'd been caught in the weather. After about 5 miles, I couldn't take it anymore. Couldn't just keep driving without understanding what I'd seen. I pulled into a closed gas station parking lot and grabbed my phone, hands still shaking as I tried to search for anything that might explain what those things were. I searched for metal statues on Indiana highways, for art installations, for anything that might be a rational explanation. Found nothing. Then I searched for strange figures on roadsides, for unexplained phenomena, for anything that matched what I'd seen. What I found instead were stories, dozens of them, from other drivers who'd encountered similar things. Figures standing on roadsides in bad weather, covered in ice or snow or fog, that moved when approached, that weren't quite human when you looked at them closely. Some people called them watchers. Others called them collectors, but nobody seemed to know what they really were or what they wanted. The stories went back years, decades even. Scattered reports from all across the country of these metallic figures standing in the weather, waiting. One account in particular caught my attention, from a driver who'd stopped to help one of these figures, thinking it was a person in need. He'd gotten out of his truck and approached it, had even touched it, trying to brush away the ice to see if the person underneath was breathing. He said the moment he touched it, the figure had grabbed his arm with a grip like a vice, cold and impossibly strong, and he'd only barely managed to break free and run back to his truck. He'd driven away with bruises on his arm in the shape of fingers, bruises that were ice cold to the touch and took weeks to heal. I looked at my own arm, at the place where I'd been gripping the steering wheel so tightly, and felt grateful I'd made the decision to stay in my truck, to not get out and approach that thing. But I also felt a creeping sense of dread, because according to these stories, once the figures noticed you, once they turned to look at you, they remembered. Other drivers reported seeing the same figures on subsequent trips, seeing them turn to watch as the truck passed, like they were waiting for another opportunity, another chance to get close. The freezing rain had stopped while I sat in that parking lot, replaced by regular snow that fell in soft, thick flakes. I sat there for another 20 minutes, reading story after story, trying to process what it all meant. Were these things alien? Were they some kind of robots or artificial beings? Were they supernatural ghosts or demons or something from folklore? Nobody seemed to have answers, just more questions and more accounts of unsettling encounters. Finally, I put my phone away and got back on the road, driving through the night with heightened awareness, watching the shoulders and the roadsides with new understanding of what might be standing there. I passed several rest areas but didn't stop at any of them. Didn't want to be stationary any longer than necessary, not until I was far away from this stretch of highway. Every shadow looked potentially threatening. Every piece of roadside debris made me tense, waiting to see if it would move. I made it to Atlanta without further incident and completed my delivery, but I couldn't stop thinking about those figures. Couldn't stop wondering what would have happened if I'd gotten out of my truck. If I had approached close enough to touch, would it have grabbed me like it had grabbed that other driver? Would it have done something worse? And what were they doing out there, standing in the weather waiting? Were they collecting something? Taking something from the people who stopped? Were they studying us, observing human behavior? Or were they just there? Inexplicable phenomena that existed without purpose or reason that we could understand. I drive that route regularly, have to for work, and every time I do, I watch for those figures. Sometimes I see them standing in snow or rain or fog perfectly still until I get close. I never stop anymore, no matter what. Have learned to harden my heart to the idea that someone might need help on the roadside. Because I know now that not everything that looks human is human. That not every figure standing in the weather is someone in need of rescue. Some things just stand and wait, patient and cold and utterly inhuman. And the only safe response is to keep driving. Other truckers I've talked to, when I've worked up the courage to mention what I saw, have had similar experiences. Not all of them, but enough that I know I'm not crazy. That what I saw was real in whatever way these things are real. We've developed an informal code, a way of warning each other without explicitly talking about it. If someone mentions seeing statues in the weather, seeing figures that move, we know what they mean. We know to be careful on that stretch of road, to keep moving no matter what we see, to trust our instincts when they scream at us that something's wrong. The thing that haunts me most, though, is thinking about all the people who don't know, who haven't seen what I've seen. Regular folks driving through bad weather, seeing what looks like someone in need, doing the decent human thing and stopping to help. How many of them have approached these figures, have touched them, have been grabbed by that metallic hand? How many of them drove away with bruises that wouldn't heal? Or worse, how many of them didn't drive away at all? I think about that sometimes late at night when sleep won't come. Think about cars and trucks pulled over on snowy shoulders, drivers gone. Nothing left but tire tracks leading to a spot where something stood waiting in the ice. I think about missing person reports and unsolved disappearances, and wonder how many of them involved a frozen figure on a roadside, a good Samaritan who stopped to help, and something that was waiting for exactly that kind of compassion to be displayed. So if you're out there driving, if you're traveling through winter weather and you see something standing on the shoulder, something that looks like a person caught in the storm, I'm asking you to remember what I've told you. Remember that not everything is what it appears to be. That some things wear familiar shapes to lure us close. Keep your windows up, keep your doors locked, and most importantly, keep driving. Don't stop, don't help, don't approach. Because those figures in the ice, whatever they are, they're patient and they're waiting. And they've got nothing but time to stand there in the weather until someone makes the mistake of thinking they're human. Story 9. The shadow that tried to open my door from Highway Hank. My name's Hank. Been driving for about 22 years now, and I've earned the highway part of my handle by logging more miles than most drivers twice my age. I pride myself on being observant, on noticing things other people miss, reading road conditions before they become dangerous, spotting mechanical problems before they become breakdowns. That attention to detail has kept me safe through 2 decades on the road, kept me out of accidents and trouble. But there was this one night in West Virginia when all that awareness, all that careful observation, became a curse instead of a blessing. Because I saw something I wasn't supposed to see, something that saw me right back. It was late September, that time of year when the days are still warm but the nights turn cold fast, especially in the mountains. I was hauling paper products from a mill in Virginia, heading northwest toward Pittsburgh, running through the mountains of West Virginia on Route 19. The road twisted and turned, climbing and descending through valleys and over ridges, the kind of driving that requires constant attention. My headlights swept back and forth across guardrails and rock faces in dense forest, creating moving shadows that danced at the edges of visibility. Around 11 at night, I was starting to feel the fatigue settling in, that heaviness behind the eyes that tells you it's time to find a place to rest. I'd been pushing hard to make up time after a late start, and I knew I was approaching my legal limit for hours behind the wheel. I started watching for a place to pull over, preferably a rest area or truck stop, but I knew this stretch of road didn't have many options. Most of the pull-offs were small scenic overlooks barely big enough for a car, let alone a full-size rig with a 53-foot trailer. I rounded a curve and my headlights illuminated a wider shoulder ahead, one of those unofficial stopping spots that truckers use when they need a place to park for the night. It wasn't ideal, just a gravel strip carved out of the hillside with barely enough room for one truck, but it would have to do. I signaled even though there was nobody behind me, old habits dying hard, and carefully maneuvered my truck onto the shoulder, getting as far off the road as possible while making sure I was level enough to sleep comfortably. I went through my shutdown routine, checking my mirrors, setting the brake, making sure everything was secure. The area around me was pitch black except for my running lights, dense forest pressing in on both sides of the road. I could hear the wind moving through the trees, that rushing sound that's almost like water, and somewhere in the distance an owl was calling. Normal night sounds, nothing that should have made me uneasy, but I felt it anyway. That prickle at the back of my neck that tells you something's not quite right. I ignored the feeling, told myself it was just fatigue and the isolation of being alone in the dark woods. I turned off my running lights to save battery, plunging everything into absolute darkness, and climbed into the sleeper berth. I kept a small reading light clipped to the wall, and I turned it on, pulling out the paperback novel I'd been working through. Reading for 20 minutes or so before sleep was my usual routine, helped my brain transition from the alertness of driving to the relaxation needed for rest. I'd been reading for maybe 10 minutes when I heard it, a sound that didn't belong, with the wind and the owl and the occasional car passing on the highway. It was a scraping sound, like something being dragged across gravel, slow and deliberate. I froze, holding my breath, listening intently. The sound stopped, and for a moment there was just silence and the pounding of my own heart. Then it started, again closer this time, definitely moving toward my truck. I set down my book and moved quietly to the front of the sleeper, peering through the curtain that separated it from the cab. Through my windshield I could see nothing but darkness, just the vague shapes of trees silhouetted against a slightly less dark sky. But I could still hear that scraping sound, and now I could hear something else too, a kind of shuffling like footsteps but heavier, dragging slightly. Something was out there. Something was approaching my truck. My first thought was that it was an animal, maybe a bear or a deer, and I should just stay quiet and let it pass. But the sound wasn't quite right for an animal. Had too much rhythm to it, too much purpose. I reached over and turned on my running lights, wanting to see what was out there, needing to know what was making those sounds. The lights clicked on and illuminated the area around my truck, and at first I didn't see anything unusual, just gravel and trees and the empty road. Then I saw the shadow. It was on the passenger side of my truck, cast across the gravel by my running lights, but it was wrong, all wrong. Shadows are supposed to be attached to something, supposed to be cast by an object blocking light. But this shadow had no source, no object casting it. It was just there, a human-shaped darkness on the ground, and it was moving independently, sliding across the gravel toward my passenger door. I watched in frozen horror as the shadow reached my truck and began to climb up the side, defying physics and logic and everything I understood about how the world worked. It flowed up the steps and reached my passenger door, and I could see it clearly now through my passenger window. A two-dimensional darkness pressed against the glass like a silhouette cut from black paper. It had the shape of a person, arms and legs and a head, but no features, no depth, just absolute darkness in the shape of something human. Then it tried the door handle. I heard the click of it, saw the handle move as the shadow manipulated it from outside. My door was locked, thank God I always locked my doors, but the shadow kept trying, kept working the handle up and down with increasing urgency. I couldn't see how it was doing it. Couldn't see any three-dimensional hand or fingers, just that flat darkness pressed against my window while the handle moved on its own. I fumbled for my phone, thinking I should call someone, the police or roadside assistance or anybody, but my hands were shaking so badly I dropped it. The phone fell into the gap between my seats and I couldn't reach it without getting closer to that passenger door, closer to that shadow that was still trying to get in. So I just sat there, pressed against the driver's side door, watching as that impossible thing tried to force its way into my truck. The shadow stopped working the handle and seemed to pause, as if thinking or reassessing. Then it began to spread, flowing up and across my passenger window like spilled ink, covering the glass completely. Through the darkness, I could feel it, looking at me even though it had no eyes, no face, just that flat black surface. But I could feel its attention, could feel the weight of its gaze, and it was hungry, intensely and terribly hungry for something I couldn't name. It started moving again, flowing around to the windshield, spreading across the glass like a living stain. Within seconds, my entire windshield was covered, blocking out everything, leaving me in darkness except for the small reading light in my sleeper. I could hear something now, a sound coming from the shadow itself, a whisper that seemed to bypass my ears and go directly into my head. It wasn't words exactly, but I understood the meaning anyway. It wanted in, it wanted me to unlock the door, it wanted me to invite it inside. And here's the terrible part, the part that still shames me to admit. I almost did it. There was something about that whisper, something almost hypnotic that made unlocking the door seem reasonable, seem like the right thing to do. My hand actually moved toward the lock, fingers reaching for it, ready to flip it and let that shadow inside. I was maybe an inch away from touching the lock when some deeper part of my brain screamed at me to stop, to wake up, to fight against whatever influence the shadow was exerting. I jerked my hand back and pressed it against my chest, holding it there with my other hand to keep it from moving again. The whispering intensified, became more insistent, more urgent, and the shadow began to pulse against the windshield, pressing in like it was trying to break through the glass. I could see the windshield flexing slightly under the pressure, could hear small creaking sounds as it was tested. I didn't know if glass could hold against something like this, didn't know if physical barriers meant anything to a shadow with no source. In desperation, I reached over and turned off my running lights, plunging everything into complete darkness. I don't know why I did it. Maybe some instinct that shadows need light to exist, that they're defined by the presence of illumination. For a moment after the lights went out, there was absolute silence and absolute darkness, and I held my breath, waiting to see what would happen. Slowly, gradually, I became aware that I could see through my windshield again. Not clearly, just vague shapes and the faint light of stars, but the shadow was no longer covering it. I waited, not daring to move, listening for that scraping sound or the whisper or any indication that it was still there. Minutes passed, 5, then 10, and I heard nothing but normal night sounds, wind and distant traffic and my own breathing. Finally, after what felt like an hour but was probably only 20 minutes, I worked up the courage to turn my running lights back on. The area around my truck was empty, just gravel and trees and the road, no shadow, no signs that anything had been there at all. I sat in my driver's seat until dawn, not sleeping, barely breathing, just watching the windows and mirrors for any sign of that darkness returning. When the sun finally rose, painting the mountains in shades of pink and gold, I felt safe enough to get out and inspect my truck. I walked around it carefully, checking every surface, looking for any evidence of what had happened. The gravel around my passenger side was disturbed, scuffed in patterns that looked almost like something had been dragged across it, but that could have been from anything. My door handle showed no signs of tampering. The locks worked perfectly, everything was normal and undamaged. I climbed back into my cab and sat there for a while, trying to decide if I should report what I'd seen, trying to figure out what I would even say. That a shadow with no source had tried to get into my truck? That something impossible had wanted me to let it in? It sounded crazy even to me, and I'd experienced it. I imagined trying to explain it to a police officer or a dispatcher and could picture the skeptical look, the subtle suggestion that maybe I needed to see a doctor, maybe take some time off the road. So I said nothing, just started my truck and pulled back onto the highway, continuing toward Pittsburgh like nothing had happened. But everything had changed. My understanding of the world had shifted in some fundamental way. I'd always believed in what I could see and touch in the solid reality of the physical world. Now I knew there were things that existed in the gaps, things that were real but didn't follow the rules, things that moved in shadows and wanted things from us that we couldn't understand. I ignored the feeling, told myself it was just fatigue and the isolation of being alone in the dark woods. I turned off my running lights to save battery, plunging everything into absolute darkness, and climbed into the sleeper berth. I kept a small reading light clipped to the wall and I turned it on, pulling out the paperback novel I'd been working through. Reading for 20 minutes or so before sleep was my usual routine. Helped my brain transition from the alertness of driving to the relaxation needed for rest. I'd been reading for maybe 10 minutes when I heard it. A sound that didn't belong with the wind and the owl and the occasional car passing on the highway. It was a scraping sound, like something being dragged across gravel, slow and deliberate. I froze, holding my breath, listening intently. The sound stopped, and for a moment there was just silence and the pounding of my own heart. Then it started again, closer this time, definitely moving toward my truck. I set down my book and moved quietly to the front of the sleeper, peering through the curtain that separated it from the cab. Through my windshield I could see nothing but darkness, just the vague shapes of trees silhouetted against a slightly less dark sky. But I could still hear that scraping sound, and now I could hear something else too, a kind of shuffling like footsteps but heavier, dragging slightly. Something was out there, something was approaching my truck. My first thought was that it was an animal, maybe a bear or a deer, and I should just stay quiet and let it pass. But the sound wasn't quite right for an animal. Had too much rhythm to it, too much purpose. I reached over and turned on my running lights, wanting to see what was out there, needing to know what was making those sounds. The lights clicked on and illuminated the area around my truck, and at first I didn't see anything unusual, just gravel and trees and the empty road. Then I saw the shadow. It was on the passenger side of my truck, cast across the gravel by my running lights, but it was wrong, all wrong. Shadows are supposed to be attached to something, supposed to be cast by an object blocking light. But this shadow had no source, no object casting it. It was just there, a human-shaped darkness on the ground, and it was moving independently, sliding across the gravel toward my passenger door. I watched in frozen horror as the shadow reached my truck and began to climb up the side, defying physics and logic and everything I understood about how the world worked. It flowed up the steps and reached my passenger door, and I could see it clearly now through my passenger window. A two-dimensional darkness pressed against the glass like a silhouette cut from black paper. It had the shape of a person, arms and legs and a head, but no features, no depth. Just absolute darkness in the shape of something human. Then it tried the door handle. I heard the click of it, saw the handle move as the shadow manipulated it from outside. My door was locked, thank God I always locked my doors. But the shadow kept trying, kept working the handle up and down with increasing urgency. I couldn't see how it was doing it. Couldn't see any three-dimensional hand or fingers. Just that flat darkness pressed against my window while the handle moved on its own. I fumbled for my phone, thinking I should call someone, the police or roadside assistance or anybody. but my hands were shaking so badly I dropped it. The phone fell into the gap between my seats and I couldn't reach it without getting closer to that passenger door, closer to that shadow that was still trying to get in. So I just sat there, pressed against the driver's side door, watching as that impossible thing tried to force its way into my truck. The shadow stopped working the handle and seemed to pause, as if thinking or reassessing. Then it began to spread, flowing up and across my passenger window like spilled ink, covering the glass completely. Through the darkness, I could feel it looking at me, even though it had no eyes, no face, just that flat black surface. But I could feel its attention, could feel the weight of its gaze, and it was hungry, intensely and terribly hungry for something I couldn't name. It started moving again, flowing around to the windshield, spreading across the glass like a living stain. Within seconds, my entire windshield was covered, blocking out everything, leaving me in darkness except for the small reading light in my sleeper. I could hear something now, a sound coming from the shadow itself, a whisper that seemed to bypass my ears and go directly into my head. It wasn't words exactly, but I understood the meaning anyway. It wanted in, it wanted me to unlock the door, it wanted me to invite it inside. And here's the terrible part, the part that still shames me to admit. I almost did it. There was something about that whisper, something almost hypnotic that made unlocking the door seem reasonable, seem like the right thing to do. My hand actually moved toward the lock, fingers reaching for it, ready to flip it and let that shadow inside. I was maybe an inch away from touching the lock when some deeper part of my brain screamed at me to stop, to wake up, to fight against whatever influence the shadow was exerting. I jerked my hand back and pressed it against my chest, holding it there with my other hand to keep it from moving again. The whispering intensified, became more insistent, more urgent, and the shadow began to pulse against the windshield, pressing in like it was trying to break through the glass. I could see the windshield flexing slightly under the pressure, could hear small creaking sounds as it was tested. I didn't know if glass could hold against something like this. Didn't know if physical barriers meant anything to a shadow with no source. In desperation, I reached over and turned off my running lights, plunging everything into complete darkness. I don't know why I did it. Maybe some instinct that shadows need light to exist, that they're defined by the presence of illumination. For a moment after the lights went out, there was absolute silence and absolute darkness, and I held my breath, waiting to see what would happen. Slowly, gradually, I became aware that I could see through my windshield again. Not clearly, just vague shapes and the faint light of stars. But the shadow was no longer covering it. I waited, not daring to move, listening for that scraping sound or the whisper, or any indication that it was still there. Minutes passed, 5, then 10, and I heard nothing but normal night sounds, wind and distant traffic and my own breathing. Finally, after what felt like an hour but was probably only 20 minutes, I worked up the courage to turn my running lights back on. The area around my truck was empty, just gravel and trees and the road. No shadow, no signs that anything had been there at all. I sat in my driver's seat until dawn, not sleeping, barely breathing, just watching the windows and mirrors for any sign of that darkness returning. When the sun finally rose, painting the mountains in shades of pink and gold, I felt safe enough to get out and inspect my truck. I walked around it carefully, checking every surface, looking for any evidence of what had happened. The gravel around my passenger side was disturbed, scuffed in patterns that looked almost like something had been dragged across it, but that could have been from anything. My door handle showed no signs of tampering. The locks worked perfectly. Everything was normal and undamaged. I climbed back into my cab and sat there for a while, trying to decide if I should report what I'd seen, trying to figure out what I would even say. That a shadow with no source had tried to get into my truck? That something impossible had wanted me to let it in. It sounded crazy even to me, and I'd experienced it. I imagined trying to explain it to a police officer or a dispatcher, and could picture the skeptical look, the subtle suggestion that maybe I needed to see a doctor, maybe take some time off the road, so I said nothing. Just started my truck and pulled back onto the highway, continuing toward Pittsburgh like nothing had happened, but everything had changed. My understanding of the world had shifted in some fundamental way. I'd always believed in what I could see and touch, in the solid reality of the physical world. Now I knew there were things that existed in the gaps, things that were real but didn't follow the rules, things that moved in shadows and wanted things from us that we couldn't understand. I tried everything I could think of to make it stop. I tried turning off the radio again and again, but my hands kept freezing before I could reach the power button. I tried unplugging it, but I couldn't make my arms extend far enough to reach the connections. I tried covering my ears to block out the sound, but the voices didn't come through my ears. They came from inside my head, had somehow gotten past the radio and into my mind directly. They were speaking to me from the static, but the static was now everywhere, in the air around me, in my thoughts. In the space between moments, the voices began to harmonize, multiple tones blending together into a sound that was almost musical but profoundly unsettling, like a choir singing in a language that predated human speech. The sound resonated in my chest, made my teeth ache, caused the windows of my cab to vibrate in their frames. And beneath the harmony, underneath all the voices, I could hear something else, something vast and patient, something that had noticed me and found me interesting in the way a scientist might find an insect interesting. Then they asked me a question, all the voices speaking in perfect unison now, creating a sound so layered and complex it seemed to come from every direction at once. "Do you want to know?" they asked, and I understood instinctively what they were offering. They could tell me everything, could reveal all the secrets of the universe, could answer every question I'd ever wondered about. All I had to do was say yes, was agree to let them in completely, to open myself fully to whatever they were. I wanted to say yes. God help me. I wanted to say yes. The temptation was incredible, overwhelming. The promise of knowledge and understanding dangling in front of me like forbidden fruit. But something in their tone, something in the way they asked, told me that saying yes would be the end of me. Not physically, but in some other way. Something more fundamental. I would learn everything but lose myself in the process. Become a vessel for those voices, a radio that only received their signal. So I said no, forced the word out through lips that didn't want to move, through a throat that tried to close against speaking. "No," I said, and then louder. "No, I don't want to know." The voices rose in volume, became angry or maybe disappointed, hard to tell with something so alien. They told me I was making a mistake, that I would regret this choice, that they were offering me a gift most humans would kill for. But I kept saying no, kept refusing them, kept holding on to my sense of self even as they pushed against it, trying to force their way in. Finally, gradually, the voices began to fade. The static decreased in volume, the harmonics resolved back into chaos, and then slowly, normal CB chatter started to filter back in. I could hear other drivers talking about a truck stop up ahead, someone asking about weather conditions, the familiar mundane conversations that suddenly seemed beautiful in their ordinary humanity. The voices were gone, receded back into whatever space they'd emerged from, leaving me alone in my cab with a radio that now worked normally. I pulled over at the next rest area and sat there for 2 hours, shaking, trying to process what had happened. My radio worked fine, showed no signs of malfunction or interference. I listened to it carefully, monitoring multiple channels, but there was nothing unusual, just normal traffic and normal voices saying normal things. Whatever had spoken my name, whatever had known all those private details about me, was gone, or at least silent for now. I've thought about that night constantly since it happened, tried to understand what those voices were and where they came from. Were they something in the radio waves themselves? Some kind of intelligence that exists in electromagnetic frequencies? Were they something supernatural? Spirits or entities that can travel through technology? Or were they from somewhere else entirely? Something so far beyond my understanding that I couldn't even properly categorize them. Other drivers I've talked to, in those rare moments when I actually speak, have told me similar stories. Voices on the radio that know too much, that say things they shouldn't be able to say, that offer knowledge in exchange for something unnamed. Most drivers who experience it do what I did, refuse the offer and hope the voices go away. But a few say yes. And according to the stories, those drivers are never quite right afterwards. Keep driving their routes, but there's nobody home behind their eyes. Like something's wearing them instead of being them. I still drive. Still haul loads across the country, but I'm more careful now about my radio use. I keep the volume low, keep one hand near the power button, ready to shut it off at the first sign of static that sounds wrong. And I've accepted that silence, the silence that gave me my nickname, is not just preference but protection. Because there are things in the static, things that watch and wait and listen, things that know your name and everything about you, things that want to offer you gifts that come with prices you can't afford to pay. So if you're out there driving, if you hear static on your radio that sounds different from normal interference, if you hear voices underneath that static speaking in harmony, and especially if you hear your name being called in that stretched out wrong way, do what I did. Say no, refuse whatever they're offering, and hold on to yourself with everything you have. Because knowledge might be power, but some knowledge comes from sources that will take everything you are in exchange for everything you could know. And that's a trade that benefits only them, never you. Story 11. The woman who sang in my empty cab from Diesel Dave. Name's Dave. But everyone on the CB calls me Diesel Dave because I've been driving diesel rigs for close to 28 years, and I wouldn't have it any other way. Love the sound of a diesel engine. Love the torque and the power and the reliability of them. Started driving when I was 21. Fresh out of a bad marriage and looking for a fresh start. And I found it behind the wheel of a Peterbilt hauling freight across this great country. In all those years, I've spent more nights alone in my cab than I can count. Gotten used to solitude. Learned to be comfortable with my own company. So you can imagine how unsettling it was when I discovered I wasn't alone anymore. When I realized someone had been riding with me for miles and miles, singing softly from the sleeper berth. It happened on a clear autumn night in Nebraska, one of those perfect evenings where the air is crisp and cool and the stars spread out above you like diamonds scattered on black velvet. I was hauling agricultural equipment from Iowa, heading west toward Colorado, running on Interstate 80 through the endless cornfields and prairie that make up that part of the country. The road was straight and relatively empty, just the way I liked it, giving me plenty of time to think and reflect and enjoy the simple pleasure of driving. I'd stopped for fuel and food around 8 p.m. at a truck stop outside of Grand Island, topped off my tanks and grabbed a sandwich and coffee from the restaurant. The place was busy, full of other drivers and travelers, people coming and going in that constant flow you see at truck stops along major highways. I'd eaten my meal, used the restroom, checked my load and my truck, all the usual routines. Everything had seemed completely normal when I climbed back into my cab and pulled out onto the highway, resuming my journey west. For the first hour after leaving that truck stop, everything was fine. I listened to the radio, some classic rock station out of Omaha, singing along quietly to songs I'd known since I was a teenager. The miles rolled by steadily, marked by the rhythmic passage of fence posts and mile markers in my headlights. The moon was nearly full, bright enough that I could see the landscape around me, rolling hills and fields stretching out to the horizon in every direction. Around 9:30, I turned off the radio to give my ears a rest, preferring to drive in silence for a while and just listen to the sound of my engine and the road. That's when I first heard it, so faint I almost missed it. Almost dismissed it as imagination or wind or some mechanical sound from my truck. It was singing, a woman's voice, soft and melodic, coming from somewhere behind me. I glanced in my rearview mirror, checking the road behind me, thinking maybe I'd somehow left my radio on or my phone was playing something. But the radio was definitely off and my phone was in my pocket, not connected to anything. I listened more carefully, trying to locate the source of the sound. And I realized with a cold shock that it was coming from inside my truck, from my sleeper berth. The voice was singing a song I didn't recognize, something slow and sad. The lyrics too quiet to make out clearly, but the melody hauntingly beautiful. My first rational thought was that I'd somehow left my phone in the sleeper, and it was playing something, or maybe I had a radio back there I'd forgotten about. But I knew neither of those things was true. Knew my phone was in my pocket and I'd never installed a radio in the sleeper. My second thought, less rational but more frightening, was that somehow someone had gotten into my truck while I was at that truck stop, had climbed into the sleeper berth and hidden there. Maybe a hitchhiker or someone desperate for a ride, maybe someone with worse intentions. My heart started racing as I considered the implications. I was doing 70 miles an hour on a highway with someone hiding in my sleeper berth. Someone who was now singing, apparently comfortable enough to make noise. I checked my mirrors again, looking for a place to pull over safely, planning to confront whoever was back there and either help them if they were in need or defend myself if they meant harm. But before I could find a suitable spot, the singing stopped abruptly, cut off mid-note like someone had hit a pause button. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the singing had been, pregnant with tension and uncertainty. I waited, listening intently, trying to hear any sound that would tell me someone was moving around back there. Nothing. Complete silence except for my engine and the road noise. I debated with myself for a moment, trying to decide the best course of action, and finally decided I couldn't just keep driving without knowing what was happening. I started to slow down, preparing to pull onto the shoulder when the singing started again. This time it was louder, clearer, and I could make out some of the words. She was singing about the road, about endless miles and empty spaces, about driving forever without arriving anywhere, about being caught between destinations with no way to stop. The voice was beautiful, I have to admit that, even through my fear. It had a quality I'd never heard before, crystalline and pure, hitting notes that seemed impossible for a human voice. But there was also something profoundly sad about it, something that spoke of loneliness and longing, and a grief too deep to articulate in ordinary speech. I found myself almost mesmerized by it, my foot easing off the brake, my plan to pull over temporarily forgotten as I listened to that impossible voice singing its impossible song. Then she sang my name. Not Diesel Dave, but my real name, David Michael Porter, and she sang it like it was part of the song, weaving it into the melody so seamlessly that it took me a moment to realize what I was hearing. She sang about my life, about the marriage that failed and the children I rarely saw anymore, about the loneliness I tried to fill with miles and movement, about the emptiness I carried with me no matter how far I drove. She knew things about me that nobody knew, private thoughts and secret regrets, and she sang them all in that beautiful, terrible voice. I slammed on my brakes, not caring about the load or the highway or anything except making this stop, making it end. My truck shuddered to a halt on the shoulder, trailer swaying slightly before settling. I threw it in park, set the brake, and twisted around in my seat to look at the sleeper berth. The curtain that separated it from the cab was closed, just as I'd left it, a dark blue fabric barrier between me and whatever was back there singing. I sat there for a long moment, breathing hard, trying to work up the courage to open that curtain. The singing had stopped again when I'd hit the brakes, cut off instantly like it had been before. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears, could feel sweat running down my back despite the cool night air. Part of me wanted to just jump out of the truck and run, leave it all behind and deal with the consequences later. But another part, the part that had been driving trucks for nearly 3 decades, refused to be chased out of my own cab by a voice. I reached back and grabbed the curtain, took a deep breath, and yanked it open. The sleeper berth was empty. Completely, totally empty. My sleeping bag was folded neatly where I'd left it, my pillow propped against the wall, my duffel bag with my clothes sitting in the corner. There was nobody there, no place someone could hide, no sign that anyone had been there at all. I climbed out of my seat and into the sleeper, checking every corner, looking under the mattress, searching for any evidence that I hadn't been alone. Found nothing. I sat on the edge of my bed trying to process what was happening. I'd heard the singing, I was absolutely certain of that. It hadn't been imagination or fatigue-induced hallucination. The voice had been real, had sung my name, had known things about me that were true, but there was nobody here, had never been anyone here, which meant that either I was losing my mind or something impossible was happening. I decided to get out of my truck entirely, to stand on solid ground and breathe fresh air and try to clear my head. I opened the cab door and climbed down, and the moment my feet hit the pavement, I heard the singing again. But this time it wasn't coming from inside my truck, it was coming from outside, from the darkness beyond my headlights. I looked in the direction of the sound and saw her standing about 50 feet away at the edge of the road, where the light from my running lights faded into shadow. She was wearing a white dress that seemed to glow faintly in the moonlight, and her hair was long and dark, hanging down past her shoulders. I couldn't make out her features clearly from this distance, but I could see that she was the source of the singing, could see her mouth moving, her arms held slightly out from her sides in a gesture that seemed almost like an invitation. She sang louder now, and the song was about loneliness and trucks and drivers who never stopped moving, who carried their solitude with them like a second skin. I should have gotten back in my truck and driven away, should have left immediately and not looked back. But instead I found myself walking toward her, drawn by that voice, by the terrible beauty of her song. With each step I took, I could see her more clearly, and what I saw made me want to stop, but my legs kept moving anyway, carrying me forward against my will. Her face was wrong, I realized as I got closer. Beautiful but wrong, the features too perfect, too symmetrical, like a mask of a human face rather than an actual face. And her eyes, when I got close enough to see them, were solid black. No whites, no iris, just darkness that reflected the moonlight like pools of oil. She stopped singing when I was about 10 feet away, and the sudden silence was jarring, like waking from a dream. I stood there looking at her, and she looked back at me, and neither of us spoke for a long moment. Then she smiled, and when she did, I saw that her teeth were wrong too. Too many of them, too sharp, arranged in rows like a shark. "David Michael Porter," she said, and her speaking voice was just as beautiful as her singing voice, just as mesmerizing. "You've been alone for so long. Let me ride with you. Let me sing for you. Let me fill the empty spaces." I wanted to say yes, God help me. Part of me desperately wanted to say yes. Because she was right, I had been alone for so long, and the loneliness was heavy, was crushing, was a weight I carried every single day. The idea of having company, even impossible company, even a beautiful monster who sang in the darkness, was tempting in a way I couldn't fully articulate. But something in her eyes, some hunger I saw there, told me that whatever she was offering came with a price I couldn't afford to pay. "No," I said, forcing the word out through a throat that wanted to stay closed, through lips that wanted to form different words. "No, I don't want that." Her smile faded, replaced by something that might have been disappointment or might have been anger, hard to tell with a face that wasn't quite human. "Are you sure?" she asked, taking a step closer. "I could make the loneliness go away. I could fill your cab with music and your heart with something other than emptiness. All you have to do is say yes, invite me in, let me ride with you." "No," I said again, more firmly this time, taking a step backward toward my truck. "I'd rather be alone." She tilted her head, studying me with those black eyes, and I had the impression she was looking deeper than my surface, seeing things about me that even I didn't fully understand. "Most people choose differently," she said quietly. "Most people are so afraid of being alone that they'll accept any company, even mine. You're unusual, David Michael Porter. You embrace your solitude even though it hurts you." I didn't know what to say to that. Didn't know how to explain that I'd learned the hard way that some kinds of company were worse than being alone, that filling emptiness with the wrong thing only made the emptiness deeper. So I just kept backing toward my truck, keeping my eyes on her, ready to run if she moved toward me. But she stayed where she was, standing at the edge of the light, watching me retreat. When I reached my truck and climbed up into the cab, she spoke one more time. "I'll be here when you change your mind," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the distance between us. I'll be waiting, David Michael Porter, because eventually everyone changes their mind. Eventually, the loneliness becomes too much to bear alone. I didn't respond, just climbed into my cab, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I pulled away, I looked in my mirror and saw her still standing there, growing smaller with distance but never moving, just watching me drive away. I drove through the rest of the night without stopping, not even for fuel, running my tanks nearly dry before I reached a truck stop in Colorado just after dawn. In the daylight, everything seemed normal again, mundane and ordinary and safe. I tried to convince myself that I'd hallucinated the whole thing, that the stress and fatigue and isolation had finally gotten to me and caused me to see things that weren't there. But I knew better. I knew what I'd heard, what I'd seen, who I'd spoken with at the side of that dark highway. Since that night, I've been more careful about where I stop, more aware of the singing I hear on the wind or in the distance, because she was right about one thing. I do carry my loneliness with me, have learned to live with it, have almost made peace with it. But I also know now that there are things out there that feed on that loneliness, that sense it like sharks sense blood in the water, that offer to fill the emptiness with themselves. And I've heard from other drivers, in those conversations that happen late at night in truck stop diners when everyone's too tired to maintain their usual guard, about the woman in white who sings beside the highway. Some of them have accepted her offer, have invited her into their cabs, and according to the stories, they're never alone anymore. She rides with them constantly, sings to them day and night, fills their trucks with her voice and their minds with her presence, and they can't make her leave, can't get rid of her once she's been invited in. Can only drive and listen and slowly lose themselves in her endless song. So I stay alone, choose my solitude deliberately and completely, because I know now what the alternative is. Better to be lonely than to have company that consumes you. Better to drive in silence than to be filled with a voice that's beautiful and terrible and ultimately destructive. The emptiness I carry might hurt, might weigh me down some days more than others, but it's mine, it's human, and it's real. And that's worth more than all the songs in the world, even songs sung by something beautiful standing at the edge of the darkness, waiting for the next driver who can't bear to be alone. Story 12. The Rest Stop Without Footprints from Ghost Gear. Gary, they call me Ghost Gear Gary because I'm real quiet when I shift. Got a smooth touch with the transmission that other drivers say is almost supernatural. Been driving for about 17 years now. Started young and worked my way up from local routes to cross-country hauling. I take pride in my driving and treating my truck right and being professional and safe and reliable. But there was this one night in Wyoming, this one impossible experience at a rest stop, that made me question everything I thought I understood about the physical world and the laws that govern it. It was late January, the dead of winter, and I was hauling industrial machinery from Montana down to New Mexico, running south on Interstate 25 through Wyoming. The weather had been brutal all day, temperatures well below zero, wind howling across the plains, strong enough to buffet my truck and make steering a constant challenge. Snow had been falling on and off, not heavily but enough to make the roads treacherous, and I'd been driving carefully, taking my time, not pushing harder than conditions allowed. Around midnight, I saw a sign for a rest area 5 miles ahead and decided to stop. I needed to use the facilities and stretch my legs, and I wanted to check my load and make sure nothing had shifted in all that wind. The rest area, when I pulled into it, was fairly large, with a good-sized parking lot and a modern building lit up against the darkness. There were 3 other trucks already parked and a couple of cars, enough to make me feel comfortable that it was a safe, populated place. I parked my truck, set the brake, and climbed down, immediately hit by the bitter cold. The temperature had to be at least 20 below, and the wind made it feel even colder, cutting through my heavy jacket like it wasn't there. I hurried toward the building, watching my step because I could see patches of ice on the pavement. The snow had stopped falling, but there was maybe 3 inches of it on the ground, more in the drifts where the wind had piled it up. Inside the building it was warm and bright, fluorescent lights humming overhead, and I stood in the entry for a moment just appreciating the heat. The place was clean and well maintained, with tile floors and informational displays about Wyoming wildlife and history. I headed for the restrooms, used the facilities, washed my hands, and stood at the sink for a moment studying my reflection in the mirror. I looked tired, I thought, the lines around my eyes deeper than I remembered, but that was just part of the job, part of the price you pay for living on the road. When I came out of the restroom, I noticed something odd. There was a coffee machine in the corner, one of those fancy ones that makes different kinds of coffee and hot chocolate, and someone had left a cup sitting on the counter beside it. The cup was still steaming, clearly fresh, but I didn't see anyone around. I looked toward the entry and saw that the automatic doors were closed, nobody coming or going. The building felt empty except for me, though I knew that couldn't be right because there were other vehicles in the parking lot. I walked over to one of the large windows and looked out at the parking lot. And that's when I noticed the second strange thing. The snow covering the ground was pristine, unmarked by any tracks or footprints. The 3 other trucks and 2 cars were parked exactly where they'd been when I arrived, but there were no tracks leading from any of them to the building. No footprints in the snow, no tire tracks showing how they'd gotten to their parking spots. No disturbance in the white surface at all except for my own footprints leading from my truck to the door. I stood there staring out the window, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Those vehicles had to have been driven here by someone, had to have parked at some point, and those drivers had to have walked to the building if they wanted to use the facilities. But there was no evidence of any of that. Just smooth, unbroken snow everywhere except where I'd walked. I checked my own footprints, making sure I wasn't imagining things, and they were clearly visible. Dark impressions in the white snow showing exactly where I'd walked.